right. Okay, Supervisor Mulhern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The last couple of meetings that we've had cannabis items, there's been some members of the audience that have been pretty distracting. And so with the limited amount of time that we have for today's meeting, I'm hoping that we can stay focused and stay on track and not have any noises from the audience, if that's, I know you're chairing the meeting. I don't want to disrupt your role as the chair, but I also really want to stay focused and on track because we don't have much time today.
All right, we're going to end by noon today, and we're going to get through these agenda items. Okay, so first off is agenda item 2A, discussion and possible action, including providing recommendations to staff and a referral to the Board of Supervisors recommending approval of the County of Mendocino Cannabis Department monthly update for March. Okay, and so we have the report in our packet. I hope everyone out there can see that. And hopefully, well, we will go to the director of the Cannabis Department. I hope that you can do this within like 5 minutes. Just give us an overview of what you're seeing here. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So updates on the local equity entrepreneur program. We have paused both the equity eligibility application review and the grant application review, but the waiver program is still open. So I just want to repeat, the LEAP waiver program is still available to applicants who have been deemed equity certified. Excuse me. We did attach, just for public review and consideration, the response we received from GoBiz regarding the fourth solicitation to the state for equity funds, so that can be viewed in the attachment for the report today. Local Jurisdiction Assistance Grant Program, we have paused the Local Jurisdiction Assistance Grant Program until further notice. Department staffing and contract planning services. I'm going to pass this over to Alora, who's going to provide a brief update on the department staffing and contract planning services.
Good morning, Board. CEO Antle. Elora Babini, Chief Planner for the Mendocino County Cannabis Department. I just want to give a brief update on our current staffing. We currently sit with 12 staff persons, including Director Nevedal and myself. We have conducted roughly 35 interviews since moving to our Willits location when we got the available space to fill open positions. We have 2 potential new hires and have 2 positions pending requisition approval to receive candidates. We are waiting for a list to hopefully fill one of our open administrative supervisory positions. Like many other departments, we struggle with hiring, and this has become a little bit more difficult with our transition to Willits. We have promoted staff when possible and have a hardworking team. We are running at half staff, and every person is working over the top with limited resources that we have with a tremendous workload. With 35 interviews, management has conducted about 70 hours with 2 staff persons to conduct these interviews. We have filled 3 positions and promoted staff internally. We have made 3 offers that were rescinded by applicants and are currently in the process of doing reference checks for 3 other positions.
All right, thank you.
Moving on to application processing update. Department staff is currently focused on reviewing renewal applications and has 168 renewal applications in the review queue. 77 applications are under final review. 31 of those need compliance plans. 14 have been deemed non-responsive. 15 are under vegetation modification or tree clearing review.
Yeah, this is on page 3.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, I moved on to page 3.
Yeah.
20 are under sensitive species habitat review, and 55 are in need of site inspections. 7 of these applicants do need some sort of DCC license alignment, and 3 of them need administrative permits before their cannabis permit may be issued. In reference to the In Good Standing portal, the In Good Standing portal actually closed on March 12th. I accidentally have the 15th in here, my apologies. Applicants submitted over 79 different AG numbers into the IGS portal. Staff to date has conducted 142 reviews, resulting in 7 complete applications. There are 20 statuses that have not been updated as the time of writing this report. 12 of the submissions we had received at the time of writing this report had been deprioritized, so those will not be reviewed until they are reprioritized. And there's 42 recent submissions that are waiting to be assigned to planners for review. Phase 3 applications, all Phase 3 applications, with the exception of one that has not been paid for,
Okay,
have.
excuse me. With all the, well, the AG numbers, how many AG numbers do we have?
Approximately 835. I'd have to look at last month's report. I don't have that number prepared on the top of my head for today.
Like the total number of, applicants?
Again, I don't have that number in front of me. I'd have to open up last month's report.
Okay, maybe you can get that later in the meeting.
I got it right here. I think this is the
Okay.
one.
And then
According
with,
to last month's report, there were 832 active AG numbers, meaning active applications and permits for commercial cannabis cultivation and nursery operations.
how many was that?
832 as of February 11th.
Okay. And then there's different buckets with those 832, right?
Correct.
Okay. Can you tell us what those buckets are?
I mean, there's buckets inside a bucket. So of active AG numbers, some of them are permits and some of them are applications. Out of the 832, there's a number that have been deprioritized due to not having a DCC license or delinquent taxes, or perhaps both, no license and delinquent taxes.
So do you have any numbers on those, like the 832?
832.
Or where can we find that?
Well, in the February report, we did provide tables that show the percentage that's deprioritized. So if we take 832, we multiply it by 25%, there's about 208 or so that do not have state licenses. 832 times 30%. There's 250 that just have delinquent taxes. And there's about 374 that have both delinquent taxes and no DCC license on record.
Out of those 832, how many are active permits?
Out of 832, there are 238 issued annual permits. However, a number of these have also been deprioritized. So out of 238, there's a 25% deprioritization rate. So about 60 are deprioritized of the annual permits that have been issued.
So in that case, if a person has a permit and they're deprioritized, that means we're not processing the Appendix G.
Or perhaps the renewal, if the renewal was submitted and paid for after the directive to prioritize applications that have paid any commercial cannabis taxes and have a DCC license. So
Okay. And then with the staffing, so going back to this LEAP or the 4-leaf contract, so the board approved it on February 28th, I believe. So according to the plan for the schedule that we have here, that we're supposed to have 27 planners working in the months of March and April to get these people processed in time. And that was with those people, that contract starting right away. Did that contract start right away?
Yes, it did.
What day did it start?
Well, I know that we did initial on-board meeting with 4-leaf contract planning services last week on Wednesday, on March 1st. Was the first time we met. We onboarded their team last week on Wednesday, and then we have training scheduled for tomorrow and Wednesday, and they will be receiving their assignments in their folders today.
So there's a training manual. That's been a question that I've seen,
There's not a training manual.
or whatever training document they're working with.
There is a list of acronyms. There's a list of naming conventions. There's a list of folder structure, how to use the folders, how to utilize the tracking tool. So as we assign, how do folks use that tracking tool to document the work that they've been conducting and to notify us what's been assigned. There's also timesheets that are going into every one of those applications that have some instruction associated with them. We will be doing in-person work group session type training. So we'll be pulling out ag zoning application, and we'll be working through that together. We've copied and pasted some zoning tables. We've provided links to the ordinances and both 10A17 and 20.242. But there is no official training manual.
Okay, so you feel like they'll be trained when they come on?
I feel like they'll be trained as we do spend 2 days in training with them. And
Okay,
then we
and-
have daily meetings, so as questions come up, we will field those questions in a daily meeting.
And we have 20 of those people?
There are 14 currently, so we'll be moving forward with the 14.
But they haven't been onboarded or trained yet.
That starts tomorrow and is also going to be occurring on Wednesday of this week.
Okay, so I guess my question is, we have this chart, for the timelines and the processing. We were supposed to be processing people in
Yep.
March and April with 27 planners.
It-
So if we don't onboard them until Wednesday, that's like, we're talking April at this point.
If I may, there's additional information about what we've been working on, so if I may work through the report, I believe it will answer these questions you have, Supervisor Heschak.
All right, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have assigned the Phase 3 applications. Corrections letters were sent out by Friday of last week. Priority application review, so to ensure that applicants holding provisional state licenses are eligible for licensed renewal on or after July 1st of 2023, when we see these environmental requirements for license renewal be elevated due to statutory deadlines, the department will first review the applications that obviously have those provisional licenses scheduled for renewal in July. So we have identified 57 AG numbers that are scheduled for provisional license renewal in July. Because some of the 57 are on the same parcel, staff has identified 45 projects associated with those 57 AG numbers to assign to planners for immediate review. As of March 20th, 17 projects had been assigned and 28 were scheduled to be assigned to contract planners for review. Of the 17 projects that had been assigned to department staff, 5 are renewals that we've been reviewing for a while and are in the final stages of review. 8 were recently assigned renewals that went out either last week or the week before, and 4 were being reviewed in the in good standing portal. So we'll be assigning those 4 that are in the in good standing portal to the planner in-house that has reviewed those throughout the course of the portal. 13 of the AG numbers are associated with provisional licenses that renew in a month other than July 2023. So what we did is we said, okay, if there's applicants who have more than one license on a parcel, and one of those licenses is scheduled for renewal in July of 2023, we pulled the other licenses and their projects into the July review timeline so that we can assess both types of cultivation that they might have, perhaps as an example, and their nursery as one project review. So again, we will be assigning 28 projects to contract planners, and that will occur today. So that's approximately half of what is supposed to be assigned for March and April has been assigned and is under review.
I guess the big question is, are we on track for the July DCC renewal deadlines, are we on track to get those done by the end of April?
I believe so, but, you know, until we get some time reporting back, I won't really know more. So I believe we are on track.
Okay. All right, anything else with your report?
Nope, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, Supervisor Mulheron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we talk for a minute about the LEAP pause? And I listened into the MCD update, so thank you for doing those. So for the tax fee and waiver program, applicants could potentially use that to pay their 2022 taxes? That was a
Yes,
question. And who's going to process those?
We process all waivers internally, so we are still processing waivers.
Okay. Is it possible for the department to send out a Canna note? Actually, probably have a list of things that could potentially be in a Canna note. I think it's great that you're doing the videos and the updates, but unfortunately, not everybody has time to watch those. So there's a lot of rumors circulating in the community about the pause of both grant programs, but especially around LEAP. And I want to make sure that cultivators know that they can still use that program to pay their 2022 true-ups. So if we could send out a Canna note that might include that information, I think that would be really helpful.
We can push that out later today, I believe.
And thank you for the application processing update. So these numbers don't include anybody that was deprioritized, is that correct?
No, the numbers do not include deprioritizations.
Do we know how many applicants for July, August, and September have been deprioritized? And that might not be a number that you have in front of you, but is that something we could find out?
If I have the time to crunch the numbers,
You don't,
Perhaps.
I don't think it needs to be right this minute, but is there a ballpark? Is it 50? Is it 100? Do we know what that number looks like for those first 3 months?
I do not know how many have been deprioritized. And if they're deprioritized because they don't have a state license, we wouldn't have them scheduled pursuant to a month because there's no renewal month. So there are approximately 109 that are deprioritized just for taxes. I could sort this spreadsheet quickly and try to give you a ballpark.
Well, I wouldn't imagine that of the 109 that have been deprioritized, that those are all in the first 90 days of the July timeline. So I just wanted to check in about what does that number really look like? But it's okay if you don't have it right this moment. I didn't.
There are currently approximately 15 that are deprioritized that appear to have licenses that renew in July of 2023.
Okay, that were deprioritized because of taxes?
Correct.
Okay. So adding those into the work plan, if they're able to go in and if the payment plan moves forward and they're able to pay their 2022 taxes is going to add definitely more of a challenge to the department and the contractors.
Well, I think there's some things to consider here with the timeline of a payment plan going into place and becoming available and then the payment of those taxes. It appears that that timeline will be after April, so they'll actually be folded into the timeline with the next group, I would assume, at this point, who are scheduled to renew in August of 2023 at the state. Right, so if we still have to complete the ordinance and then there's a 30-day resting period and then folks would have to come current on their taxes to get back into the queue, if that's the board's will, then we would not see them be able to clean up their taxes, so to speak, to be reprioritized until, when would that be, Council Curtis, at the earliest? The tax?
I'm sorry, we're talking about the effective date of the tax ordinance or the, if it were to pass tomorrow in its current form, 30 days thereafter, which would be, I believe that's going to be April 27th, I want to say. Sorry, my math is bad.
Well, so not until May, but so we would be folding in July people in the May's work structure to try to get them processed if they're able to go through the,
We would be
Payment
adding
plan?
them to the reviews we'd be conducting in May if they had paid their taxes. If the payment plan moves forward, right, and they've come current on their taxes or at least current enough to qualify for reprioritization, we would fold them into the reviews we assign in May or as we wrap up the July reviews, right, the July renewals at the state.
okay. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about with LEAP is, you know, we've received the scorecard, the public has received the scorecard, and I really feel like right now, the department's priority is on getting applicants through the process. And certainly, I think we all would like to go after another additional round of LEAP funding in the future, but as that deadline isn't until October, I want to make sure that you're not investing a lot of time in that right now and that our attention is focused on getting the applicants through and not on reapplying for the funding.
The solicitation for another round of LEAP funding will not occur until probably the fall of 2023.
Right. Yeah, so we can just keep working on processing our current applicants, our current LEAP waiver program people, and just moving through that. I understand that there are a lot of questions from the public, and I just think that that conversation can maybe be put on hold for a little while.
Is that it? Okay. Well, just going back to that question about the 15 people that might come back into the system, and I just had a conversation with a person who had late taxes and had come in to pay them and was paying about between $30,000 and $40,000 of late taxes. And so that was a hopeful sign that people are taking this seriously, and they're going to take advantage of this waiver if it continues on as voted on by the board. But if we have 15, that's, according to the 200 hours per applicant, that's 3,000 hours. And so where are we going to get those people to deal with that kind of workload?
I think we'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it. So if all 15 of these folks reprioritize, we will put them into the queue. And perhaps it won't take 200 hours for every one of these applications. We did put time tracking sheets in every one of the applications that we're assigning to contract planners, and they're going into our planners' packets as well. And so we'll have to monitor and see how it goes.
Okay, Supervisor Mulhern?
Yeah, I had a question. Maybe it's for the CEO and Council Curtis, or maybe the department can answer about the state and the LJAGP grant. So first of all, is there an update from conversations with the state? And second of all, in the letter that was received to the board at our last meeting, the state had asked us to hold off on using the grant funds. It seems like if we are going to use Four Leaf as our assistant contractors, we're not able to really staff up the department in a way that would really be meaningful to be able to spur the applications along. We've recognized that we need to use this contractor. Is the state okay with us using funds to pay them so we can keep processing? How's it looking from the DCC side?
If I may, through the chair.
Yes.
This last Friday, CEO Antle, Director Nevidal, and I did meet with DCC for a number of hours. I thought that was really quite a productive conversation overall. If I may just start with sort of the broad picture of what we're looking at here. We're talking about the possible shift of and the streamlining of the local process and essentially shifting the environmental review over to the state side to take the Appendix G away from the department and let the state essentially do its own environmental review for their own discretionary permit process. The DCC was quite open to that. They're looking roughly at a prospect of if we do in fact implement this change, they would ask that we take a portion of the LJAGP funds to fund a EIR for the benefit of the state that is specific to Mendocino County and specific to state licensing in Mendocino County. That would do a couple of things. One is under their existing statutes, they indicated that would extend the timeline that they can renew the provisional permits by another year while that contract is in place and while that process is ongoing. Would also allow them to essentially adopt what I would call the Humboldt model in terms of the site-specific environmental review. Again, this would be at the state level, not at the local level, but what they would be doing is looking at a CEQA addendum process as a way to address each of the individual state applications that was coming through the process. Now, on the funding side, that would require an amendment to the LJAGP grant agreement. We did discuss that would need to happen relatively quickly. We did talk about we're talking likely a pretty substantial amount of the money there. I don't think in that meeting we had discussed specifically the issue of the four-leaf contract, and the sense I had gotten, however, based on both prior conversations and that meeting, was that they weren't specifically looking to stop the expenditure on items that were still going to be necessary for the processing of the county going forward. I think we had discussed the possibility of the adjustment happening was in the area of the, I forget the term, the direct grants, was it? As the means of the funding component. Now, ultimately, that's going to be a decision, I think, for the board as to where you want that money to come from, but it does look like there is sufficient there that hasn't been obligated yet that would likely cover this need, in which case I don't believe that you would need to go ahead and stop with the four-leaf. Additionally, we typically do build in termination clauses, and I think that we've got ones. Is this one set only through the fiscal year? I'm sorry. We may be able to look at, say, terminating the agreement partway through. Say, if it's the end of the fiscal year, et cetera. If we do see significant changes, but at the moment, I don't know that we necessarily need, based on that conversation, to put an immediate halt on the four-leaf. Does that answer the question?
Yes. So, I mean, I think when would the board consider the EIR option? Because I think if it's going to extend the opportunities for a year, that's really promising news for the applicants. So what's the timeline look like?
Yeah, we're looking to get back to the board as soon as possible here. Again, this was a meeting just this last Friday. So
Sure.
we were talking about possibly April. We've got a few draft documents we'd already be proceeding on. Ideally, we'd like to have all things coming together at once. But I think we need to at least get the decision points in front of the board as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you.
And really, the decision point you're talking about would be using the LJAGP money or a part of it to pay for this EIR.
Yeah, I would say it's sort of twofold, right? So one has to do with amending the LJAGP and going ahead and contracting with someone to do the work for the benefit of the state. And that would be, again, that would be going through the contract would be with the county and the consultant, but the consultant would be working for the benefit of DCC. And that, you know, we could have potentially structured a different way if we had more time, but this is going to be the quickest and the most efficient way for us to do that. The other decision point really relates to the ordinance itself. We've got direction from the board to go ahead and proceed with the streamlining ordinance, but we need to get that in front of you for you to act on. And frankly, there may be specific parts of that where there may be decisions for the board to make as to, as we get into some of the weeds there. Are there components that you would want to take out or things that may still make sense to leave in as part of a review and licensing process? I think one of the proposals that had been mentioned was, for example, do we do this through a business license process? There's going to be some level of review that goes beyond what a typical business license would be because it's in mitigation measures in the ordinance. So do you want to keep it as something looking a little bit more like a permit process? Do you want to have it something more akin to, say, I'm blanking on the term, zoning clearance that may happen with the existing license, et cetera, as part of the business license process. We're working right now to get those sort of packaged and together for the board to be able to make its decision and move forward on that as well.
So you see this coming back, whatever ideas about streamlining there are, it will come from your office to the board directly and not come through the GGC?
Candidly, I asked that question at the last board meeting, and candidly, my recollection was a little bit fuzzy as to whether the board had wanted it coming to the committee first. I believe after the end of the conversation, I was supposed to bring it back. If there's any disagreement on that, or if the committee wants to look at the process, we can try and. I don't want to throw off anything in terms of process, but we are trying to move quickly and we are trying to follow what the board had directed. So if the committee has concerns about that, we can look at what alternative processes would be available, but I think it would require a special meeting at a minimum to be able to accommodate that timeline.
Right, it's a question about expediting this process, but also following our own kind of internal processes, right? And, I think that there's some expertise in the community too, and I think that they should be listened to before this comes back to the board, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Mulherin.
Yeah, I understand that conversation might have been a little scattered to discern. I think what we did here, though, is that we need to have stakeholder input and that the GGC seems like an appropriate place for that to happen. Because the timeline of our GGC meetings is so small, only 3 hours, I'm wondering if Supervisor Hashak and I could potentially have a workshop, more of a roundtable discussion with stakeholders. And I would look to you, Council Curtis, about what the noticing looks like for that. I would look to the clerk about the location. I don't think that meeting needs to happen on the dais. I think that meeting could happen in a conference room that's big enough for the two of us to sit and brainstorm some things with the community.
Yeah. So if I may respond through the chair, it would still be a special meeting of this committee, so, would need to be Brown Act noticed. There's no reason you can't do it in a conference room or other setting. You just need to make sure that you're, having it adequately noticed, having it posted, making sure the public's aware of it, and then I believe it may be best if you want to pick a date before the next meeting. Frankly, I think having a little bit of time for us to get you the documents and to be prepared for that, it may be good to sort of set our timeline now if the committee is open to that.
A date before the April 11th board meeting?
No, we were looking at the second meeting in April.
So a date before the 25th.
Well, we wanted to set it early enough that we would have time, you'd have time to incorporate any ideas into what you're bringing to the board. So,
Mr. Chair, if I may, and I do want to be clear, one thing that we've been trying to do as part of this process is make sure that the streamlining part is relatively discrete. So there are some decision points that I think that the board will need to make, and this committee and the public can, make recommendations and advise the board on. However, what I've suggested to the department and to my own staff is to try and keep any substantive changes part of a separate ordinance, or part of on a separate ordinance track. So really not making any too big of changes here. To have them really be process changes, and then other things like, the veg mod is on for tomorrow. Some other things, may still be considered as potential substantive changes, but to have those go through separate processes so that there's no question on the environmental review side as to whether or not those substantive changes might have eliminated our ability to do that based on the CEQA documents that would be brought forward as that. So I'm happy to schedule time now and to make sure we have time to incorporate any changes. I think that's appropriate. I do want to be careful not to create too much of a public expectation that this is the chance to lump everything in.
Supervisor Mulhern.
Well, I think that whether or not you're willing to lump it in is one thing, but an opportunity for the public and the community and the stakeholders to have input, I think that's really what I'm looking for, is the opportunity to identify those challenges that the community and the consultants are having before you decide what comes forward to the whole board. That's my opinion.
How about April 13th in the afternoon? Yes, CEO Antle.
I would just request that we give the clerk time to look at that and see if that works, and that there's not another meeting scheduled at that time.
Yes.
I'll be in Sacramento at the Ledge Conference on April 13th.
Okay, how about April 14th?
This is Atlas Pearson, Senior Deputy Clerk of the Board. The 14th Board Chambers is available, but I will note that COB is going to be short-staffed that day. So we can probably make it work, but we won't have our full team here due to prior obligations.
Could we look at April 6th? And I don't think we want to, I don't think we want to meet here in the chambers. I think we want to meet in a conference room that has Zoom capabilities.
April 6th, the Board Chambers is booked, but we could do it in an alternate location.
Great, thank you.
Let's,
And Mr. Chair, if I may, the deputy that I have working on this will be at the Planning Commission meeting here on April 6th. Also, if we're looking at that early, certainly if the committee just wants to get public input, that may be viable, but I don't know if we're going to have draft documents ready quite that quickly.
If I may, I would want to check with the other conference rooms, so maybe that's something we can do offline and come back and talk with you all. I do know April 5th, 6th, and 7th are budget conferences, and I'm not quite sure which room, so we would have to be moving things around. So if we could get that to you by the end of the meeting, those dates, and have that discussion.
Mr. Chair, if April 13th is a date that seems to be working, I could leave CSAC early, and perhaps we could do sort of a 4 to 6 or 7 or something like that, sort of an afternoon thing.
Yeah, it would have to be an afternoon.
If you, excuse me, if I may, again, if you're going into the evening hours, that is overtime for staff, so
Yeah.
just something else to consider.
Well, how about April 18th?
Mr. Chair, that does only give 2 days before we publish.
Yeah.
Well, Council Curtis, I guess we're looking towards what's the best way for the community to provide feedback. I think, we often get e-comments and public information that is unable to be incorporated sometimes, and sometimes it is able to be incorporated. It leads to a level of frustration because folks aren't sure why or why not things are being incorporated. It seems like scheduling a workshop is a challenge. I suppose if the two of us do it because the Brown Act requirements, could potentially one of us just do it? Could the chair host a meeting and I'm just not there?
Yes, that's certainly an option as well. I would suggest just timeline-wise, I think given our constraints, the week of the 10th is really going to be the best for us to be able to have a document and then to be able to turn around any changes or revisions that are requested in that time frame. You certainly could do it without it being the full committee. You could just have one of you.
Well, I have something there. Yeah, I have a 2:30. So with the Ledge Conference, I have that on my calendar, but I wasn't going to go to it because we have closed session on the 12th at 10 a.m. You're going to go after that?
No, I'm going to do that from Sacramento.
You're going to do the closed session from Sacramento. Okay.
I have a 2 o'clock on the 10th, but could potentially do from 3 to 5.
Well, I have a 2:30 to 4.
Okay.
4:30. Could we do 12 to 2:30? We do it through lunch? The 10th.
I'm certainly happy to make whatever time this committee would like work.
Well, why don't we say the 10th, 12 to 2:30?
Well, we'll be driving back from Healdsburg from the GRT, unless it was changed.
So we have to be in Healdsburg, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Maybe this is something we should do on a break.
Yeah.
It seems like the calendars are not
We
aligning.
could burn through a lot of time.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll
Well, I think that the intention is to get into a workshop style meeting in some way the week of the 10th.
What ab-
Understood.
What about the 14th? Does that work? Like after 10:30?
CEO Antle, if I may, through the chair, I would just want to confirm that I think you're thinking of using the conference room C. I just want to confirm that, so I can check those dates. I can get back to you after break.
Okay, great. We'll leave it at that then. So just going back to county council and this EIR, and do you think that the time, looking at the timelines, if the board does approve to go forward with adjusting the LJAGP budget, then the timelines, you know, they're giving us a 1-year extension, and, you know, it seems like that's ambitious.
I would concur with that, and if I may be candid, we had looked at a little bit of a longer timeline in terms of getting the ordinance and getting the amendment in front of the board. DCC was anxious to try and get that expedited and to get that going as quickly as possible. In fact, I think the question I had gotten when I had provided my estimate of timing was, is that the soonest? The 1 year would be, I think, ambitious is a fair word. You know, there's a possibility that, you know, that would buy a little bit of time for the possibility of any legislative adjustments, you know, if that might be on the horizon. I would also say, you know, there are certain things about how they might be limiting the scope of the project that may be helpful towards getting an EIR completed within that timeline. It'll still be an extremely aggressive timeline, but by keeping it limited to Mendocino County, by keeping it limited to state licensing in Mendocino County, which they have already studied more broadly, and by looking at a particular path, aiming at the addendum process, and particularly possibly retreading some of the work done in Humboldt, you know, there are things that may be reason for optimism, but I don't want to say that that's, I certainly don't want to say that it's not an ambitious timeline, because it is.
Okay, and so my understanding is that there would be, the county would be using the environmental document, the mitigated negative declaration, for our permit, and then the state would be using this EIR for their state licensing.
That's correct. So under the existing county scheme, there was never a requirement for any site-specific environmental review, and that was actually by design. As I understand it, the request was that we want to make it as simple as possible for the cultivators in going through the application process, and there had been concern at the time that site-specific environmental review would be costly, it would slow things down, et cetera. What we didn't know at that point was that the state would itself be doing a discretionary permit system, which meant that site-specific environmental review was unavoidable. And that's how we ended up with the Appendix G process to try and bridge that gap between a ministerial permit system and a discretionary permit process on the state side, with the state trying to rely on environmental review from the locals and not be doing it themselves. This would simply take back that piece that was theirs to begin with, and then the county would be issuing its ministerial permits based on the programmatic environmental review that it's done, but not need to generate this Appendix G document to try and complete the state's site-specific environmental review.
Okay, and so if that goes through, then some of this work that we're doing with four-leaf and, you know, would not be necessary.
That's correct. Certainly the Appendix G would not be necessary, and part of the idea on this is that a lot of the work that goes into the permit review process now would not be necessary. A lot of this, there are some things that would have to be kept, sensitive species habitat review, water availability, possibly a few other things. But a lot of the things that are being checked at the moment would not need to be reviewed before a business license or whatever the document is could be issued. They're matters that could be treated as an after-the-fact enforcement, right? It's still a substantive requirement. You still have to comply with all of those, but it's not necessarily something where we've checked every single box before that document goes out the door.
All right, so in the meantime, we will continue acting and doing everything we can as if we don't have this option.
Correct.
Okay. Supervisor Mulherin.
Thank you. I've asked this question several times, and I just want to make sure that we're clear about the LEAP eligibility for equity operators and the state license process that's going to end on March 31st. So with the pause of LEAP, except for the tax waiver program, there's not an intention to process the equity operators. So will those folks not have a chance to apply for a state license? Do we know how many people that could potentially be, and how many, I know that it's a guessing game at this point, but how many properties might that mean would no longer be in our cannabis program?
Well, I do want to note that I did my math incorrectly when it comes to deprioritization numbers. So there are 371 AG numbers that are deprioritized. 93 are deprioritized solely for not having state licenses. And then there's another 167 that don't have state licenses but are also delinquent in taxes. So some portion of that combined 93 and 167 are folks who perhaps could have become equity eligible and qualified for a provisional license at the state, but I don't know how many of those individuals who don't have state licenses applied for equity. I do know.
So
that
I
there's-
guess one of the questions follow-up to that would be if there's 371 that are deprioritized, and that's more than we thought, then there might be more than that 15.
No, I don't believe so, because there's only 111 who are delinquent just because of taxes. I went through the workbook and sorted it per this conversation just now, and there are only 15 individuals with delinquent taxes who, according to our records, have provisional licenses that renew in July of 2023.
Okay. County Council, is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, although I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. And CEO Antle, did you have anything to add to the discussion with the DCC, your point of view?
I just appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with them and to try and get this moving forward. Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else before we go to public comment? Okay, this is supposed to be an hour item, so if there's public comment, make sure it covers new ground. Okay? All right. Any public comment on item 2A?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, supervisors, county staff. Michael Katz, Executive Director of the Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. There's a lot to unpack from this conversation, so I will try to keep it brief. It's definitely confusing to try to wrap one's head around how we could actually be on schedule to process the applications that were not deprioritized, given the fact that we don't have the full 20 planners that were discussed. So if we have 14 planners, an X number of staff, and those people were supposed to be processing just the prioritized applicants, and now we're talking about reprioritizing other applicants, that those numbers just don't make sense to me. So it would be great if we could actually maybe dig in a little bit on how that actually will meet the deadlines. So that's one item. There are, talking about deprioritization, I think we made clear here that with the deadlines, and we'll get to this later as well, with the timelines of implementation, there's going to be this gap that we don't know how many people there are in right now. And so the need to be able to reprioritize folks before they can pay, if they're planning to participate, is still very important, so we don't see these people removed from the program. We fully support the workshop. Thank you so much for really trying to push to make that happen. It is really important to integrate as much stakeholder feedback as possible, and not to limit the idea of what might be doable, given various considerations and various types of changes that could potentially be made. I really, on the equity side of things, the fact that there is still no eligibility being processed beyond the March 31st deadline, the ability to use the tax and fee waivers. If people aren't continually being processed into the equity program, they can't have access to these really important programs. So we sincerely urge the committee to direct that at least one staff member be put back on equity eligibility applications. Even if we can't get back to direct grants, those access to those funds is really important. And, you know, finally, fully agree that on the equity item, we should come back to it later in terms of revisioning the responses. But just to be clear from the report, it's clear that there is a lot in our responses that led to the failure to receive funds. It wasn't exclusively the 5-mile radius. As far as the EIR conversation and the conversation with the state, we certainly believe that the stakeholders should be very involved in that as well, and so we look forward to having conversations and workshops accordingly. Thank you for your consideration.
Okay, thank you. Just, Ms. Hannah, just a second. So with the question about the staffing we were talking about earlier, if we only have 14 from the 4-leaf planners, then that means we only have, say, 20 planners when the whole system is set up for 27 planners.
4-leaf does have additional planners available, however, they are wrapping up projects. So until they've wrapped up projects that they are on, we won't be able to realize additional planners.
So it sounds like we're falling behind already.
I don't know that yet. I mean, we have, as I mentioned, we have a number of renewals that have been in-house under processing for quite some time. So some of those have been wrapped up, some of those are just about ready to wrap up. And so I would appreciate the opportunity to speak to this next month.
All right, because just what I've seen is we were supposed to be having 27 planners working on this for 2 months to stay on track. And if we don't have it, it just, in my brain, I say we're falling behind.
If perhaps, but again, we did assign renewals prior to the March 1st timeline for this. Those renewals are in a final review stage. So we're ahead on some reviews and perhaps behind on others. So hopefully it balances out, but I cannot provide insights as to whether or not we're behind until we've processed some of these applications that have been assigned. So I think it would be most appropriate to pick this question up next month.
All right. Ms. Hannah Nelson.
Thank you, Hannah Nelson. And unfortunately, I have mostly questions, but also a few hopeful suggestions, and I appreciate all the hard work that everybody's doing. I'm a visual person, so I'm trying to sort all of this information in terms of kind of like different flows. And I recognize that we have to be operating on all cylinders at once. So there's kind of like the all cylinders at once thing and then different buckets. And that flow might have to shift at each moment. But I think that it's imperative that we look at each bucket of things and play it out to the end and not just assign it a bucket. So what I mean by that is, in taking this, we need to proceed as currently operating. We've got the processing of permits, whether they're annuals, and by the way, I got a bunch of people who have annuals who have been told that they are at the end process for forever, so I don't know what that means exactly in terms of time, and I look forward to that actually moving along. But, you know, permits processing, who's doing the APGs at this point? Like, that kept flipping back and forth. People who were waiting for LJGAP funds, I'm just talking, let's say, the first July, August, September cohort. Let's just even break it down to that little amount. Some people have done their APG work on their own. Some people were waiting because it kept changing, and then they were waiting for grant monies. And now that's all halted, and so the question is that part of the workload that's plotted out, processing applications, APGs, as well as whatever else needs to happen? I think that these details are not meant to criticize anybody or be contrary. It's just to really understand the mechanics, to see if, as we keep revisiting them, if things do need to be adjusted. And so I hope that the comments that are asking about these technical details and how things move along are not taken as criticism, but the need to closely keep track so that if readjustment is needed in one area, it's looked at. The other thing that really confused me is the phase 3 assignments. Like, I really understood that none of the phase 3 stuff was going to be dealt with until all of the phase 1 and phase 2 people were dealt with. So the fact that any energy is being spent other than receiving the application just is mind-boggling to me, but maybe I'm wrong in my memory of what that order and priority of the board was. A small detail with respect to Supervisor Haschek, you were asking about training of 4-leaf and when that's happening and what it's happening, and I totally appreciate that it really is substantive to happen in person in workshops, but Ms. Nevidal, many, many, many months ago, you had referred to a 27-page training document that you prepared. You said it in a public meeting. And we have been trying to get copies of training materials that might be being used by the department as well as to use for 4-leaf, not just because we want to pick it apart, but because we want to look and see if we have suggestions from the other side of how maybe things could be dealt with more smoothly and speed things up and efficiently. So I would ask about that 27-page document. There was a reference to the next group, and it sounds like what's happening is the same kind of thing that happened with the portal. And again, I'm guessing because we don't have the information, but that all other work stops, like things are batched, and there's like a freezing, as opposed to a rolling situation. And so it would be great to have clarity about that, because I might be wrong and misunderstanding what that is. I want to reiterate something that Michael said about processing LEAP eligibility verifications. So people can't take advantage of the waivers, whether they're building permit waivers or tax true-up waivers or whatever, unless they've been verified. That step of verification has stopped. So we really need to figure out what staff, who can get that going. Then real quickly, The SSHR process is still opaque. There were changes made where referrals, it was announced that referrals to CDFW were not needed as much, and that comment process has shifted, but we still don't know why. The ad hoc had dealt with the Exhibit A of the SSHR process being streamlined, that never came back. It's just opaque, and again, our goal here in having transparency and really understanding these details is to assist in the efficiency, assist in the effort, to have applicants understand what they need to be doing when they need to be doing it, and what else is coming down the pike so that they're not surprised after years of waiting and given a short time, and that delays things further because they're surprised. So that is really the goal of all of this. I highly encourage a workshop. I have a feeling that 2 hours is maybe not going to be enough, but we'll take what we can get, and we very much appreciate your efforts. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. So, Director Nevedal, the question about the training material and the reference to the 27-page, and then there is LACO was being contracted to come up with training materials. And so do we have that, or are we in process
There's a
still?
27-page document that only is in relationship to reviewing for corrections portal submissions. So it was utilized to onboard new planners in the department so that they could work through corrections portal submissions. So it does not include any final review components, and in most instances does not take the individual utilizing that guidance document to the final review of specific materials. So, for example, it does not include how to fully review a site plan. It doesn't include how to fully review a Lake or Stream side alteration agreement. It doesn't include information about how to fully review a notice of applicability. It's simply a snapshot in time on how to review correction portal materials.
Okay, and then the contract with LACO.
County Counsel's office is graciously working on that contract, and it is still under review. So we hope to get it back this week, and hopefully it can start routing.
So that contract that is to provide a training manual, more or less, for the Appendix G?
That is correct. So what we envision with that contract would be that it would take the materials we have that stop at a specified point in the review process and bring them to the end of the review process. So essentially providing a training manual that gets you, the user of that manual, all the way through to the end of the review process, and it would include Appendix G materials.
Okay, but for the training that you're doing in person, you won't have that available.
We will not have that available, but it does not mean we do not have the ability to train on how to review an application and review or structure an Appendix G.
Supervisor Mulherin.
Well, I just had a question for the department and county council. Then if we move forward with an EIR with the state and the streamlining with the state, and they're taking over environmental documentation, are we spinning wheels on our own training materials and wasting money and time?
If I may, through the chair, as to Appendix G, potentially, there's definitely some inefficiency in that we are sort of planning on two different pathways in the near term, right? One is assuming that we switch. The other is assuming that the things remain status quo. Given the time crunch, I don't know that I see a way around that, although obviously we're trying to move as quickly as we can on possibly jumping rails. But quite frankly, if it doesn't happen for any reason, if the board decides that it doesn't want to pass the ordinance, go through with this, if there's some reason it falls apart at the last minute, I don't know that we really have time to sort of put a hold on the Appendix G side. I'd defer to the director and the CEO on that, but I'm quite concerned about the time crunch that we have.
Director Neville.
Even as we move into, say, if it's the board's will, into a contract to conduct an EIR, that EIR is still going to take some time. And so we should, to support our applicants and our permit holders, continue processing not only the applications and the permits, but also the Appendix G, so as many folks, while we're conducting the EIR as possible, can move into annual licensure. And so the state, it's my recollection from Friday's meeting, actually recommended that we continue forward with the Appendix G and trying to work with the state to transition as many folks as possible from provisional licenses into annual licenses, even if we are amidst an EIR or looking at a second pathway.
Okay, back to public comment.
Morning, board members, CEO Antle, County Council Curtis, Director. What have we been doing for training staff for the last 2 years of Mrs. Nevedal's tenure? There should have been a training manual by now. I've submitted a second public access to records request for the training materials for staff and for Four Leaf for this current juncture. I sent it directly to the County Council. I had an Appendix G reviewed from one of my client that got through. And it didn't take that long, and Ms. Babini was extraordinary in her assistance in reviewing that document. My final comment is, and I can give the balance of my time to Hannah if she wants it, is looking at the table for reviews. A lot of those applicants, like two of my clients are 4 and 5 years out since submittal, deemed complete in August of 2021. They're getting reviewed based upon their state provisional deadline, which is fine, cuts a pretty tight corner. And I'm doing the math on the number of applicants being reviewed in that table, still working out to 166 to 200 hours per application. 4 to 5 weeks to review a 20-page application. It's inexcusable. Thank you.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I forgot 2 questions, Hannah Nelson again, and that is, it seems that the language between review for completeness versus review for substance and final review are not necessarily, and again, it may be my misreading of the materials, but not necessarily consistently reported through. So when the report indicates referred to planners, it's kind of hard to know, is that just for the initial review for completeness and then it has to go back to planner for sufficiency, or it's just really hard to know where everything is in the process. So again, a little bit better transparency so that people can plan. Like, I would also love to hear a report on how many withdrawals there have been in the past 60 days and have that report every month, because I think that while that on the optimistic side of the timeline relieves some work, it's distressing and it's heartbreaking, and I think that we need to keep track of how that moves through. The other thing is whether or not the administrative permit process is part of this timeline, and I think that that's an important conversation too, how that's going to impact things and whether or not planners at Planning and Building who traditionally did the administrative permit process are going to be involved in processing those permits again. Thank you.
okay. Anyone from the chambers?
Good morning. I'm not sure where to start. So
Your name.
What's that? My name. Thanks. Chantal Simone Pietri, and I'm going to give you a card, Atlas, or whoever takes the notes so it's spelled properly. I've been looking back at the written comments. I almost wore a name tag today, and I thought that was overkill. So my comments may go a little out of order. I like to be more organized, but given the kind of weaving of the way that the conversation is going, I may say my largest point in the middle and then have to come back to it, and I'll try and be efficient with time. I guess the largest it's question marks sort of in all directions right now, and I really appreciate Hannah's breakdown. I missed the buckets conversation. I think I came in a couple minutes late on that. So, but as somebody who I'm a planning person by nature, not necessarily by degree, but also in my life, and in assisting people through the process and helping to give good counsel as far as what they should do now, or what they should be ready to do in 60 days, I'm totally confused and baffled as to how to give appropriate advice to a person who's in the applicant review process, or even somebody who's currently in the potential renewal review process. And I would ask that this forum, as the place where we do this, to please elongate the conversation and work through the different buckets based upon the different categories that they may fall into. Let's define what the buckets are and actually get into a timeline to of the different categories within those buckets. And basically, we've asked for this for a couple of years now, transparency as far as review and processing pathway that has never been provided. Many other jurisdictions have flowcharts that they put up onto their website that you can just go and look at to see you apply, and then you go through this, and then you go through this, and then you go through this. And it doesn't necessarily have timelines that are always met, but at least gives you an idea if you go from here until you get to there. We haven't had that in this jurisdiction ever. And we kind of piece it together from the comments that happen in these conversations and in the public meetings, and it's incredibly opaque is an appropriate term, as Hannah used. It's definitely not transparent. And I think that's kind of one sort of borderline poor government, if not definitely a poor government, and also not helpful to our local economy. If people don't know how to get basically a permit to operate their business, we're doing something wrong. That's my like mega comment. So as far as the workshop goes, definitely advocate for a stakeholder involvement and as long as possible. And I do not think even an afternoon is appropriate. There's a lot to discuss in different pathways, and it definitely needs to include the potential options prior to County Council limiting it to it being a discrete revisions that are streamlining versus process. That part of the conversation we also want to be involved in, so please don't choose the pathway prior to having there being stakeholder input. And I think the soonest that level of conversation can happen, the better, and that perhaps there need to be two, that we have an initial one, and then there's a regrouping where we hear back from County Council based upon stakeholder input, and then there's a second round of input after that. The issue of equity eligibility processing has been a conundrum for many months. I spoke about this at the last two meetings. I have a client, we submitted their local equity eligibility documentation in November of 2022. It has not been processed yet. I have a response from Director Nevedal saying that they had been paused temporarily. We submitted it in November. It's really excellent documentation. It's not a borderline one. We're not trying to stretch the 5 mile to non-camp raids. It fit what we know the eligibility criteria to be now. And so anybody who is having in the conversation surrounding tax and fee waiver, application of funds to that, they don't qualify for it if they haven't yet been deemed equity eligible. And if there's no processing of equity eligibility, that hope of assistance for people is extremely limited as far as who will apply. And so I appreciate what Michael said. Can we designate one existing, current, internal MCD staff person to please process LEAP equity eligibility applications going back to when they stopped processing them, and give us a timeline for how long it takes to process them and when they will be caught up to current. So the people that are, I'm still preparing and submitting on a weekly basis LEAP equity eligibility documentation, just sort of throwing them out there in the hopes that eventually they will be assisting them in resolving some of the hurdles they're having with having their permit not be processed, or even receiving funds that have been designated and allocated based upon LEAP eligibility that they currently can't even get into the group to qualify for. Regarding the four-leaf conversation, and the whole four-leaf conversation to me is I understand why we went down the pathway of four-leaf. I have a lot of issue with the facts that there being any of the LJAGP funds being put towards that contract when we have so many local operators that need financial assistance in order to make it through the permitting hurdles that they're currently facing. So I would like to also ask for this board or this committee to please look at what's the projected weekly cost based upon the current 14 or 20, whatever the number is that are actually hired and operating now, how much money is being spent per week starting March 1 with when they started on 4-leaf, and how effective are they? And get into some actual real concrete timeline answers with dollars connected to them. It sounds really amorphous right now, what is happening with them, and a lot of money being spent on bringing them up to speed. That connects into the training question regarding how are they being trained. If we have 4-leaf contract planners, who again, when I've worked in other jurisdictions such as in Lake County and they hired a contract planner to do their permitting process review, it took many months for them to get on board. And the process is changing along the way. And so it's in some ways, it seems like I can understand it being kind of impossible to have a training manual for them because we're changing the process live as well. But I think it's impractical to consider bringing on a contract planner from outside of the paradigm that we've all been living in, not give them training materials, and expect them to get up and going quickly to move forward a large cohort of people that we're already behind on and understaffed with to process. So without contradicting myself, I would predict that if they do not have a training manual now, that there will be inconsistencies in the review that they're doing, and that we'll be dealing with those inconsistencies in the future. I have one more comment, and then I'm done.
Thank you.
Talking about the EIR option, I guess there's 2 more comments. I'll make them both quick. Can we get into some of the numbers about what would the cost of the EIR be? Even any sort of projections? Who would be potentially conducting it? Would it be LACO again? If that fund, if those costs are coming out of the LGAGP funds, what currently is the amount of money remaining, not yet allocated or not yet spent? Those 2 different categories in the LGAGP pool. Has that ever been determined? The last conversation we had, there was an unknown amount of money remaining. Some amount was going to be reserved for direct grants. Is there any amount of money still in discussion to be reserved for direct grants? And lastly, just to look at what are you going to tell people that are currently in the process that submitted, they have their permit. Their renewal is whenever it is. Maybe they're in the worst case scenario of July 1 or soon afterward. They've submitted their Appendix G materials, let's say 18 months ago is when I submitted. My first one was Casey O'Neill's for Happy Day Farms, has not been reviewed ever. Still don't have any substantive comments on any CEQA document to know how to proceed forward. Like, what are you telling the people that you live and work around that are your constituents as far as what they should do right now? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have some comments online. Monique Ramirez.
Good morning, Monique Ramirez, District 3. I am really, really upset about the fact that the LEAP grants are not being processed anymore. And I just want to speak to this issue alone because everyone else has spoken to all the other items that you guys have been discussing. So on February 3rd of this year, my partner's direct grant application was finally approved after months and months of back and forth, waiting for the solar restrictions to be lifted from the manual, blah, blah, blah. Finally, he got the approval, and his underwriter stated in an email on that February 3rd date, please keep your eye out for an email over the next couple weeks from Kamal. He will create your legal documents. After several weeks, Gus reached out asking about these documents because nobody ever contacted him. It took all the way until last week to be informed that his legal documents were completed. And the dagger to the heart is that there is no staff to put his documents into Cobblestone, which is the next step. Director Nevedal stated in an email that they first need to hire staff and then staff training will need to take place before processing can resume. Gus asked specifically how many staff hours are needed to get his documents into Cobblestone with no reply. He also asked if farmers are allowed to apply for a position to MCD with no reply. I am begging, we are begging, our community is begging the GGC to please, please recommend to the BOS at the next meeting that MCD is directed to get all applications that have legal documents prepared and completed into Cobblestone. Otherwise, all of this budget work we did will pretty much be for nothing, because by the time the snail of a process resumes, it will be too late. And, things are going to need to be amended at that point because some of these budget items, we're going to just have to fork over with our own money because it's going to inhibit us as a business to not move forward with those things. And then we'll have to go back to make another revision change. And there's just no idea of when this is actually going to take place. And so this is the big ask today. Like, we can't just stop. And I want to know, is it only taking an hour to actually take the legal documents and put them into cobblestone? Well, why can't we just do that? Why can't we how many of those people like Gus are there that just are at that very last moment? I feel like Dorothy walking the yellow brick road and getting all the way to the Emerald City gate and being told, sorry, you can't see the wizard. And we walked all this way with the Cowardly Lion, with the Scarecrow, with the Tin Man. I want somebody to help us and be our leader and get us to the end. This is our lifeline, you guys. Like, I wanted to come there today and speak in person, but I can't do it. I've got my baby. But just know that this is like our life. And I'm so broken right now by this system. It is just appalling. Please help us. I'm waving the SOS flag. Thank you.
Okay. Paul Hansberry.
Hi, good morning. That was pretty moving. There's been a lot of talk. I won't reiterate that, but it seems to me that the county tried to beat a deadline, a July 1st deadline of getting an ordinance passed before they needed an EIR. Then after that, there was a lot of stakeholders said, well, let's just get an EIR. So we can do that because that ordinance was revoked because there was a big thing that the constituents didn't want, the 10% expansion that was insisted upon by the county. So that was revoked. But again, the stakeholders kept saying, well, let's get an EIR. Let's get an EIR so we don't have to do that. But that never happened. It was too expensive. Then the LJAGP funds, well, we're going to use that for the EIR so we can get things moving in the right direction because the ordinance really isn't a very good ordinance. So we needed something that we've learned from so we can put things together and make a smart ordinance based on what we've learned. But that never happened. And it was recommended again and again that maybe the LJAGP funds could be used for the EIR because it's too expensive for the county. So now, years later, they're talking about, oh, we went to see the state and they said maybe we should use the LJAGP funds for the EIR. That's a great idea. Let's do it. I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense. You've got the framework for a new ordinance that you can actually drill down, get some stakeholder input, and put together something that might be worthwhile for a new ordinance, along with this EIR, and you've got the funds to do it. I just wish the county good luck and know that these stakeholders are here and our brains are here for the picking. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Corinne Powell.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, Corinne Powell, cultivator, advocate, 5th District resident. Very confused, as are others after hearing this discussion this morning. A couple of weeks ago, when we did hear from DCC Director Elliott in her letter, I believe there was also an overture regarding streamlining our current permit processing. And I haven't heard any comments from those who met with the DCC to know if there were concrete proposals in that department. Because as I listened to Director Nevedal's reporting today, and I have in the past in various public settings, I see absolutely no streamlining going on. I hear that there's always a shortage of staff. Anyone who has worked with contractors can attest to the fact that there is going to be a startup steep curve for them. This is not going to be a a checkbox situation. That's not the way the DCD, the MCD has established their own policies and procedures. I have not heard anything from this committee as to how they will become involved in oversight of policies and procedures in an effort to help move things along. And most importantly, and this is certainly a personal note, but I am not alone, there is a cohort of applicants in the renewal process who have been fully permitted by the county and provisionally licensed for years, who have made no modifications to their applications, and who have submitted and who have heard nothing about assignments. I am curious to know what new tracking system Director Nevedal referenced in her report, because from my experience trying to track my own renewal application, 4 different people have told me that I need to pay my fees and that then I might be assigned to a planner. 2 people have told me that I have had my materials received. 1 person has told me that my materials have been accepted, but nobody has confirmed after repeatedly receiving my question if my application is deemed complete, which I personally believe it should be. In the last communication of March 17th, when I was told to go in and take care of my payment, which was done via state waiver on March the 1st, I don't see that any tracking system has been shared between staff. And I don't know how all that is working, but clearly it is not working. And then a final comment in this March 17th response to my query of where I might be in processing. They tell me that if I used a waiver for my permitting fees, I should note that there is potentially a 6 to 8 week time frame during which the waiver will be, quote, updated. And I would like Director Nevedal to address that particular last comment of a 6 to 8 week delay for updating a waiver granted by the state. Thank you. I hope we can get answers to many of these questions. And of course, as always, I completely support the efforts of MCA and Hannah Nelson and Scott Ward and Chantal in the work that they do to help this process along. Please take their comments and input seriously. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. All right. Director Nevedal, do you want to answer any of the questions that were brought up?
By Ms. Powell or?
Yeah, she had a couple direct questions.
Well, it does take 6 to 8 weeks for us to process a waiver. We have 1 staff person who processes waivers. That staff person is also working on the budget and does all of our fiscal reporting currently. So she processes them in batches as she, on a weekly basis as time is available.
Okay. Okay, County Council?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could just take a stab at clarifying something, and my apologies if I interjected any confusion into the conversation. With the streamlining process that the board directed at the last meeting, the idea and the directive was to try and get something in place here that would be consistent with our existing environmental measures and our existing environmental protection measures in the current ordinance. That is something, well, this is a very aggressive timeline. This is something we believe can be done relatively straightforward, in a relatively straightforward manner, because it would be a process change and not a substantive change. And what would need to be studied from an environmental standpoint would be very little or possibly nothing. In terms of my comments about sort of other substantive changes, the board and the committee can still do that. It can still look at those things. But realistically, I just don't believe we're going to be able to fit that into the current process. And part of my concern If you recall back when the board passed the facilities ordinance, that was something that had started initially as a permitting process change. It was processed under a common sense exemption under CEQA, but during the consideration, what ended up getting added was some substantive changes to the ordinance itself. We ended up with a CEQA challenge as to the sufficiency of the document, ultimately stipulated that was correct. We did make an error there. And what we're trying to do is avoid repeating the same error. What we're trying to do is make sure that to the extent we have a window here in which we can get something done that has the same or a negligible change from the environmental impact of the existing ordinance, it not get delayed or thrown off track by other changes that the board might be able to make if it takes more time and is able to go through a more involved process.
Okay, thank you. All right, is that it for public comment?
Through the chair, if I may, we have a voicemail on this item.
My name is Jude Tillman, and I speak to the GGC today on agenda item 2A, and more specifically on the need to reprioritize all cannabis operators who have been deep. My name is Jude Tillman, and I speak to the GGC today on agenda item 2A, and more specifically on the need to reprioritize all cannabis operators who have been deprioritized by the Cannabis Department. This county needs to get in sync with how the state and other counties regulate the cannabis industry. After the basic checklist requirements to obtain a permit are met, the permit is issued, period. Then, if taxes are owed or a state provisional license still needs to be obtained, those activities can be carried out within a reasonable time period. It has been well established by now that the deprioritization of so many small cultivators by the MCD was done without a factual basis and, as many have said, frivolously. How many hoops, obstacles, and barriers to entry can this county continue to invent to the detriment of bringing our cannabis producers into the legal system? Please restore a pathway to legalization by reprioritizing all those permit applicants that the MCD seeks to de facto push back into the illicit market. Support our small farmers and operators for a change. Thank you.
All right, so back to the committee.
I know that we're wanting to move on to item 2B, and we're running short on time. I just want to clarify two things. One is regarding the grants that are already in Cobblestone and whether or not those are being processed, and also the timeline of applicants that have gotten to a certain point. I'm sure the department has looked at how far people have gotten into the process before, for instance, they're in Cobblestone. So just to clarify, people that are already in Cobblestone are moving forward, and then
Frankly, no one's moving forward right now. I don't have a single employee in-house that is trained on Cobblestone. We had some training occur this past week, but I have not checked in with that staff person since their training on Thursday or Friday to see if they're available to take the grant agreements that are in Cobblestone out of Cobblestone, reformat them, get them back into Cobblestone, and then push them forward. So until we have someone who's adequately trained in-house, we cannot move those pieces forward.
okay, regarding the Cobblestone, I think that is a program that the entire county uses, not just the Cannabis Department. So can the executive office or county council help the department with training or staffing, et cetera, to be able to move forward?
Yes, CEO Antle, if I may, through the chair. This was brought to my attention last week. We did assign someone to work on this with the department.
Okay.
So I do believe those trainings occurred and items should be moving. They have a point of contact in case there's a problem or they need additional follow-up, but that happened last week.
Okay, and then just a follow-up on the timeline. So again, the GGC has said we would like to receive community feedback, and just looking at my calendar, it seems it would be the most efficient to me if we are able to host a workshop-style meeting on April 14th.
Yes.
It would be, that is available?
That is available, the 14th.
Thank you. It would seem to me, and I'm going to look at county council for this, if the stakeholders could work to consolidate their feedback and provide that in advance of that meeting, and I'm looking at April 7th, the week before, to county council so that they could at least start looking at whether or not those items are priorities, possible or not possible, then that conversation on the 14th could be more effective before it goes to the full board and streamline this entire process.
If I may, through the chair, that certainly would be helpful. However, I do want to make clear, I think we're probably looking at the 6th or the 7th as the date that the documents would be going out to the public. I'd look at and clerk of the board to make sure that we were able to line up with their publishing timeline. But I assume the staff will need a little bit, or sorry, not staff, the public will need a little bit of time to put their thoughts together to be able to provide them to us. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, well, what documents do you think that you're sending out for streamlining in advance of the April 14th meeting?
Yeah.
Your department is going to be prepared to send out documentation?
Yeah, so what I'm expecting is that we'd be bringing this committee a copy of the draft ordinance,
Okay.
As well as a draft environmental document, with an opportunity for some comment. I don't know that we've identified specific decision points just yet, and frankly, I'm not sure how many there are going to be. This is intended to be a process change, but there are some things that process-wise might still be desirable to be kept as a permitting component rather than as an enforcement component. So
if industry stakeholders have comments about what they believe should be included in the streamlining, that potentially should be to your department by March 31st, so that you can at least look at it before those documents are published on April 6th and 7th.
Sorry, we're talking about, I thought you were asking for community feedback on what we sent out. You're talking about things that we would get in advance of that.
Correct. I'm
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about how do we streamline incorporating the stakeholder feedback in advance of the workshop and certainly in advance of it going to the board. And I know that we have maybe half a dozen consultants that have worked on many applications that believe that they have some positive feedback to provide in this process as far as streamlining. So what is the best way for that to happen?
Okay, so I would suggest two parts. First is if we could get, I think maybe by Monday the 3rd, any sort of preliminary comments, things that people have before they've seen any draft, understanding the basic premise of what we're trying to do here, any input, any feedback on that point, if that could be provided to my office by then, we would have a little bit of time to put that into our draft documents. What we've commonly gotten from the public has been feedback on the draft. Sometimes the specific items or issues don't get identified until we've put that document out there. So what I would suggest is that, if we're publishing at the end of that week, then if we could get comments, I think at least a day or two in advance of the meeting on the 14th, that will do is give us some time to be able to review and be prepared and to be able to go through them at the meeting, and possibly even draft some language to incorporate potential changes that may be appropriate.
I think that would be the most efficient use of everybody's time.
Yeah, and I'm not available until 10:30 on the 14th.
And if I may, just again to touch on the prior point, one thing that would be helpful is if, in terms of the public comment, to be able to focus on things in the permitting process and the areas where there might be steps that are unnecessary or can be sort of equally well handled through enforcement, code enforcement compliance plan as opposed to, say, a pre-review and a permitting process. Or if there are areas on the SSHR, we're not going to really be able to change the SSHR as part of this process, although conceptually there is some room on maybe to be able to work out administratively some of the details with CDFW, et cetera. But what's in the ordinance, I think, because it's an environmental protection measure, is going to need to stay. But if there are areas related to this, where there are areas of confusion or things that we might be able to tackle as part of that, that might be helpful. Just understanding we're going to be somewhat limited in the world of what we're looking at on this ordinance.
Right. CEO Antle.
Thank you. Just to clarify, the 14th, we've gone down a couple of different paths on how to have that meeting. This would be the full compliance meeting, Brown Act compliant, that both of you would be in attendance. There was some discussion about just chair doing this workshop, so if I could get clarity.
Right, if we're both available that day. Yeah, it should be Brown Act compliant.
And can I get the hours again? I forgot.
10:30.
10:30? Okay.
We'll start. Okay. So just to go back to the LEAP grant and equity eligibility, it sounds like there is a deadline for making sure that people are eligible for, if they're equity eligible, there's a deadline for that. And is that not being processed at this point? And is there anything that we can do to make sure that it is?
There's no deadline for the processing of equity eligibility. We do not have staff to process equity eligibility. I think the deadline that has been brought up is in relationship to applying for provisional licensing at the state if you haven't previously applied for a provisional license. So currently, only equity eligible applicants may apply for a provisional license and receive that provisional license if they apply for it prior to March 31st of 2023. But we do not have staff to process equity eligibility applications currently.
But you do have staff that has been trained by the CEO's office to deal with putting applications into Cobblestone.
We have staff that went through a training that the CEO's office helped to line up. I have not contacted or had a chance to discuss with that staff if they are currently confident in working with what's in Cobblestone. So that conversation will happen this week once I'm not in board chambers and can schedule time to discuss the training progress with the staff person.
Okay. All right, so we need to take a break. Do you have anything else right now? Okay, so we're going to take a break till 11 o'clock.
Had, and she has them. I'm happy today with my daughter. She's the greatest thing in my life, and I'm glad to wake up and see her, and everything I do it for her.
Sí, bueno, yo también vengo de una familia separada. Creo que por eso también me motiva a estar más presente con él, de quizás también estar de la forma quizás que yo no la tuve para Máximo. Y también comprender que el padre no solo es el que pone los límites y las reglas, sino que también está ahí para hablar, acompañar, regalonear, jugar, cosas lindas también, no solo ser el guía para el niño, sino que también un compañero de vida.
I was more of a elated and thankful because for 3 months I was in baby land, and when you're in baby world, you're just kind of flying by the seat of your pants and hoping that you're just supportive in the ways that you can be supportive.
Pero pues aquí pues ya los enseñan un poquito más cosas que uno no sabía. cómo cuidarla, cómo desarrollarla, cómo educarla, y pues es algo bien porque pues cosas que yo no sabía, pues ya usted nos las dijo y todo como consejos, y pues muchas cosas que se aprendieron.
Bueno, creo que por mi parte esperaba algo totalmente diferente, como un programa más frío, por decir algo, no tan cercano a la familia, sino más bien un programa de estado programado para la ayuda solamente. Y a través del programa nos hemos dado cuenta que también pasa a ser una familia con nosotros, porque nos apoya en los momentos difíciles o cuando nos hemos visto en dificultades. Siempre nos hemos podido apoyar en Gaby a través de su programa. Encuentro que ha sido fundamental el apoyo.
You know, my experience has been nothing but positive. Annette has been wonderful. She's on time. She lets me know if there's going to be any changes in the schedule.
Not only did we get the assistance with this program, but we also made a really good friend. I'm happy to call Gabby our friend.
I still feel the challenge of being a parent now in today's world is immense. I think that you need support.
Es un gran apoyo para nuevos padres, y más aún si están en nuestra situación, que somos extranjeros, que nuestra familia y amigos, como dice Carla, están en otro país, lejos. Entonces sí, viene muy bien el programa para apoyarse tanto emocional y como anímicamente, y bueno, en varios aspectos del programa que nos ayuda a seguir adelante con esta nueva aventura.
Don't be afraid to take that step. Like, don't be afraid to get help, because, you know, you might think that you know what you're doing, but it's always okay to have extra support, and don't do it alone.
Give it a try. You got nothing to lose. It's free. I'm grateful that I took advantage, because it's something that has put me in touch with my child, or closer to my child and her development.
Personally, I think everybody could benefit from the home visiting programs.
I think that as a parent now, I'm grateful for support more than I was before.
I filled out that form not knowing what I was doing. I am very, very grateful that I did it, because it's really helping me a lot.
Bueno, creo que por mi parte esperaba algo totalmente diferente, como un programa más frío, por decir algo, no tan cercano a la familia. Y a través del programa nos hemos dado cuenta que también pasa a ser una familia con nosotros, porque nos apoya en los momentos difíciles o cuando nos hemos visto en dificultades.
Well, I was a new mom, and I had no experience taking care of a newborn.
There isn't like a book on how to raise a kid.
We come from like a lot of family history of, you know, drugs, violence, alcoholism, so we didn't want our daughter to experience any of that.
The thought that a parent was supposed to be loving, nurturing, supposed to be there for their kid, you know, provide food, shelter, joy, and going in, becoming a parent for her, I had no clue how to provide that.
Cómo pensar educarla, ajá, cómo educar a un hijo, y porque pues nosotros nunca, es la primera vez que íbamos a ser padres.
What I think parents should know about home visiting is that you can learn a lot of new things and tips and tricks, how to take care of the baby and what to do, and if you're, you know, stuck in a routine and everything being monotonous, like they give you new resources and new tools how to handle parenthood.
It was nice to have them kind of guiding me. Even though I was not a first-time mom, I felt like a first-time mom.
It totally blew my mind over time. So much information that I had no idea about. You know, she was straightforward when, you know, teaching me this stuff, and answered any of my questions. It's just a really positive experience.
What I think that parents could benefit with the program is just having someone here for you, especially for first-time parents. It can be very isolating and it can be very lonely, and having the home visitor changes that and it feels very good.
For me, having a home visitor is like having a second mom there.
A lot has changed. I'm definitely more knowledgeable taking care of her. And I know that anytime I need advice or help from somebody, I can just call her.
It's just that little positive nudge to, hey, I'm noticing something, let's find a way how to change it. And she's like, you know what, Amanda, let's pick you up, dust you off, and let's go over to, see about either getting your driver's license or seeing about, going to college, see if we can start something for you.
It's totally worth it. Like, even if you're on the fence at first, you don't feel like having a stranger coming in your house and teaching you about your little one, do it anyway. You get the help that you need. You get professional advice on things you may not know about your child. The fact that the program has no fees or anything, it's all totally free, is fantastic.
Yo creo que si conozco a alguien que está próxima a ser mamá, lo primero que haría sería recomendarle el programa porque te entrega mucho apoyo, mucha información y más que nada como apoyo emocional, una guía, te da una visión diferente
Supervisor
de cómo
Mulhern, do
ser
you have a motion to approve the last item?
Yeah, I motion we approve the Mendocino County Cannabis Department monthly update for March.
Right. Second. Roll call?
Supervisor Mulhern?
Yes.
Chair Hashak?
Yes. Okay, moving on to item 2B. And I just want to remind everyone that we're trying to get out of here at noon. Okay, so it's discussion and possible action, including referral to the Board of Supervisors regarding any appropriate direction to staff to prepare possible ordinance amendment to process cannabis cultivation applications with deprioritized status for not paying taxes and not providing proof of a state cannabis license while cultivating. And I'm going to turn this over to County Council, but we did have correspondence from the Department of Cannabis Control on this issue, and people should be aware of that too. All right, County Council?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I recognize this item has been phrased a bit broadly. There have been discussion of deprioritization in the past, and I think it's really come up on two topics. One has to do with people who are deprioritized because they're behind on their taxes, and specifically the cannabis business taxes, and that had come from board direction. There had been an item on that, and then secondarily, we had also had this issue of the deprioritization of people who weren't up to date on their provisional licenses with respect to, excuse me, with respect to the state licenses. So people that may be in the application process on the local level but hadn't applied for, hadn't received, or hadn't obtained the necessary permits on the state side. In some of the conversations that have happened at the board level, and in some of the conversations with the department, there's been some questions as to essentially what's going to happen with the deprioritization. And my perception has been that there isn't consensus on this particular topic. I think at the board level, there had been some comments that had been made that suggested that the expectation was that the people who were deprioritized would never get a permit unless and until they came into good standing by, say, paying back taxes, obtaining necessary permits on the state level, et cetera. And these have two different sort of sets of issues related to them. So maybe I can just start with the tax component. As it stands right now, there's really nothing in the ordinance that authorizes or recognizes that as a basis for not receiving a permit, as a basis for not, or a basis for having a permit application denied. I don't know that there's any problem from administrative level when we have more permit applications than we are getting through quickly, to put those ones that haven't paid it to the back of the line. But that's very different than saying never. And that's very different than saying we're going to deny. So all of those ones that are deprioritized under the existing scheme would need to be budgeted for, would need to be accounted for as part of the ultimate processing that's here. Now, I've heard comments, some comments suggesting that the expectation was for them to be denied, some comments suggesting that the expectation was not for them to be denied in terms of the deprioritization. And what I would like to ask is that the committee make a recommendation to the board really one way or the other, so that there can be some clarity going forward. Because I have a little bit of concern, particularly with respect to, and I'll get to a little bit more in just a moment here, but particularly with respect to the planning and what we're looking at in terms of cost, in terms of numbers. If we're not accounting for those as permits that are going to have to be processed, that are going to have to get through the system, we could be a little bit unrealistic in terms of the numbers that we're looking at. At the same time, I also think that the deprioritization, particularly on the tax issue, creates a bit of an unintended consequence that I just want to draw to the committee's attention, which is that under the current system, the phase 1 applicants are allowed to cultivate while they're in the application period. Deprioritization for non-payment of taxes, there's a relatively limited window of this because we also have a state provisional issue and the state deadline's coming up. But deprioritization based on non-payment of taxes creates an incentive for maybe a small sliver of people who know that they're going to be denied to not pay the taxes. I believe the intent was to incentivize them to pay, but potentially it might push them back, give them a reason to essentially not have their permit reviewed by not paying. And for that reason, the limbo that we're in, sort of not being clear whether non-payment might be a basis or denial, basis of not moving forward, versus simply going to the back of the line, may be disadvantageous. It may be better to either just scrap deprioritization on the taxes or to affirmatively take steps to move it forward as a basis for denial. The other part of this has to do with the cultivators that are that don't have a state permit and don't have a state license. And I believe, and the director can probably speak a little bit more to the nuances in how that's playing out on a practical matter. But generally speaking, you're not required, if you're not actively cultivating, you are not required to have a state permit while you're going through the application process on the local side. So let's take a phase 3 applicant, for example, not allowed to cultivate while they're applying until they get their permit, and then they have to wait for the state permit as well. They could pursue those simultaneously, but they could also wait until they see if they get the local permit, then once they get it, turn around and apply for the state permit. There's nothing wrong with that, and that wouldn't be a reason to deprioritize the person who's on that particular track, because that may be entirely proper. But the other part of that is that there may be people, I think we heard from DCC that there's a rather significant number, 200 or something, that were in our system that not only didn't have a state annual license or a state provisional license, but didn't apply for and are not seeking them. And the state had expressed some concern to us in the meeting on Friday that essentially those people who had been applying for the phase 1 permit, they may have essentially a local authorization. They may be entirely lawful at the local level, but without the state authorization, they're not able to go forward. And there was some concern about, I would say, the gap and the confusion that can create to have sort of the misalignment of the state and the local permitting status, if you will. Their request was essentially to have the local ordinance changed to align to make it clear that holding the state permit is a prerequisite to going ahead and cultivating. And part of what we had discussed in the course of that meeting, I think they were a little bit ambiguous as to what exactly they were looking for, but was potentially having it be an affirmative basis for denial in the ordinance if, and this would be only if someone is actually cultivating during the application process without state authorization to do so.
But don't we have in the ordinance where it says you have to have a state license to cultivate?
I don't believe so. We actually adopted the ordinance before the state license requirements existed. I think what we have is some language that says you need to be in compliance with state law, which is a little bit different than saying that you need to have a state license or an affirmative authorization from the state.
Okay. It just seems to me that we're talking about this window that would be very small at this point, because I don't believe we're on track with the timelines. And so whatever, if we move people from deprioritize to prioritize, they would still have a very small window to take advantage of any situation like you've outlined.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. One of the issues, though, is that we also have a very small window in to sort of figure out where these people are ending up, one way or another.
Yeah, Supervisor Mulhern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my concern with this item is that, just as you stated, that the Phase 3 operators have a couple of pathways that they would be getting their local permit and then applying for the state, or that they might do those two things simultaneously. And there is potential that some number of that 200 number of folks that have local permits had intended that they would go through the state process after. Both of these processes are lengthy and expensive, and some cultivators may have been making a choice as to what to apply for first. So you seem as though you've considered that, and I'm looking for some feedback, maybe from the department or from county council, about the fact that may have been the case for some people. And what about those folks that had all good intentions to apply for the state license after they receive their local permit, which has not even been processed yet?
And I may have some follow-up questions as to which specifically you're referring to. If we're talking about people who have applied for a local permit and are waiting to apply for a state permit, but are not cultivating, I think that we need to make sure that we're not accidentally deprioritizing those people when we shouldn't be. I think that's one piece of the conversation, to make sure that those people aren't sort of failing to move forward just because they have decided they're not going to spend the money, they're not going to go through the process of the state permit before they get the application. The other part of that is that the people cultivating illegally, essentially the ones that may be applying for a local permit, they may be authorized under the local ordinance to cultivate, but they do not have the required state licenses, and they are in fact violating the state law by cultivating while they're in our application process. And that is the area where the state had asked that we essentially make the change, so that there's no gap, there's no sort of a local approval, whereas you're lacking the necessary state approval, and you are in fact operating illegally under state law.
Just to follow up, and there are Phase 1 operators that are operating, have been operating for generations, decades, some of them, on specific sites that are no longer allowed to seek a state license. So again, some of those individuals may have been cultivating, may have not changed their environmental impact in any way, but would, in my mind, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if they're denied at this point because they didn't get a state license because they thought they were going to get their local permit first, waiting for that, didn't apply for the state license, then that individual, that family, that business, that property is out of the regulated cannabis permitting program in Mendocino County in the state of California.
If I may, I think what we may be talking about is the scenario in which you have someone who's a Phase 1 cultivator. So let me just run through a few hypotheticals. If you have someone who's a Phase 1 cultivator, say on ag land, right? That was historically where they cultivated. It's a place that they would be entitled to apply for and cultivate for in Phase 3. Conceptually, what you could do, or if you were to do an ordinance change that would make illegal cultivation during this time to be a basis for denial, right? Essentially, not saying you have to have your state license to be in our application process, but that if we find that you are cultivating and you don't actually have the required state permit for that, we're going to deny you your application for the permit. What would happen for that person is that they would then have to, obviously they'd have to stop cultivating. They need to come into compliance, which is already what the requirement is under state law. Their current application would be denied, and then they would have to reapply essentially once they had gotten things into compliance and sort of start over. I think what you might be referring to, Supervisor Mulhern, is a situation in which someone is cultivating in an area where you're only allowed to cultivate if you were a Phase 1. right? So that you're not currently a phase 3 cultivator. Now, if you put it in there for denial, under the current ordinance, that would mean that that site would essentially be extinguished. And that was part of the policy choices that were made with the initial ordinance, was that there was a desire essentially for those legacy sites, once they had to be, the cultivation had to stop, once they had been abandoned, et cetera, to be no longer used, and to sort of push the cultivation into those zones where it was considered to be more appropriate or more desirable. I would say that's also, and that is, if you simply put in something for denial, that is a consequence of what would happen because of this other policy in the ordinance. I would say you also have the ability, quite frankly, if you want to have it be a basis for denial, to potentially have some system in there for resurrecting those sites. I would suggest you probably not do it indefinitely, that they have a certain amount of time at most to be able to come back in and reapply on that one after they had extinguished the prior illegal cultivation. So that's ultimately a policy choice for the board and for this committee to recommend to the board.
Director Nevedal.
Yes, thank you. I do think there's also some pieces here with whether or not phase 1 folks are operational or non-operational. So currently, the individuals that are deprioritized due to not having a state license essentially have an operational status with us, meaning that if they're a permit holder, right, they have not filed a non-cultivation, which would be a non-operational status, or as an applicant, they have not filed a notice of application stay, which would be a non-operational status, which leads the department to assume that they're operational. Of course, we have not inspected them, but that is the concern, that they're operational and perhaps have been operational for a number of years without ever applying for or obtaining a state license, which, as Council Curtis referenced, is a requirement in order to be able to conduct commercial cannabis activities.
Mr. Chair, would it be all right if I just clarify a statement I made before, or correct, I should say? One of my deputies noted to me, the issue on terms of the permitting standard is that there is language in the ordinance that talks about making sure that you have a state license. The issue is actually that it applies specifically to the permittee. So the way we phrased it was working under the assumption that no one would be cultivating until they had a permit. I think that was the original intent of the ordinance before the phase 1 issue came up, and it looks like we had never really circled back and tackled that part with respect to the people who are allowed to cultivate while they are in the application process.
So I guess one of the areas we're talking about is the people who maybe applied for or got a permit and then haven't grown or haven't applied for the state license, and what to do with them, right? And there's possibly people who got a permit and decided to wait until more favorable conditions to get a state license. They didn't want to pay that tax or go through those hoops, right?
Yeah, but I believe that those people are still cultivating. I think that's where our challenge is, right? Is that people were waiting for a local permitting process, continued their cultivation, continued their business, and didn't finish applying for the state licensing because it's additional fees and whatever have you for their choices.
Right. So those people, if they're either following, they have a stay on their permit, or they're growing, right? Yeah, Director Nevedal.
Folks who are fallowing are still required to have a state license. So fallowing does not exempt you. It's not a non-operational status. You still have to maintain state licensure because there's the assumption that you are producing or have produced and may have cannabis for sale. So,
right. Okay.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I think there's a little bit of a danger that when we talk about, fallowing, non-operational, et cetera, we keep looking at the classification and the permit status. Really, the question for the purposes of the state licenses is, are you engaging in an activity that requires a state license that you don't have? And that may or may not line up to various statuses that we may have internal to the county. You know, it'll look like fallowing, but there are some things that are allowed under fallowing that may still require a state license. There may be situations where you know, the non-op may cover it, but you also don't have to have a non-op, right? You can be applying for a permit as long as you are not actually cultivating or engaging in one of those activities for which the state license is required. You don't need to have gone for non-op status. We can't just assume that you actually are cultivating because you haven't applied for it. In fact, prior to anyone falling into this, we would need to have actual information, and we would need to sort of figure out you know, what's the reason we think that they are cultivating, and we can't just make that assumption based on what their permit status is.
Supervisor Mulhern.
Yeah, I just have a question regarding process. It seems like because of the meetings happening with the DCC and because of streamlining, because this letter came so quickly after your meeting in preparation of this meeting, it does seem like you're looking for a quick turnaround timeline from this body to provide a recommendation to the full board. So I'm checking in about what the timeline is that is your expectation.
If I may, I don't know that this is quite as urgent. Right?
Okay.
This is not a prerequisite, say, to moving forward on the other parts. My concern actually is on this one, a little bit more what happens if the streamlining process doesn't go through, right? Because we have this rather substantial number that are quoted as deprioritized, and we're going to have to figure out what that means. And we need to be planning sort of in advance as to how many people we think we have going through, right? And what the deprioritization status means, where they get counted, where they are in terms of the estimate. This is a little bit more from the department standpoint, but it's come from the conversations with the department as to what the estimates are, et cetera. You know, we need some clarity on that. And I think having conflicting statements, conflicting expectations maybe among the board, I think it's important just to make sure that we get to a final resolution in a manner that lets us plan accordingly.
Supervisor.
So we need to take this in several pieces. So regarding the state's letter and the individuals that have a local permit and may be cultivating, the County of Mendocino could potentially send a letter that says, hey, go apply for your state license. You need to do this. We have you know, information from the state that this is required and we want you to go do it now. Whatever. We understood you may be waiting, what have you. People that are in specific zoning districts will be able to do that. Others may not, which would essentially be a denial before they even do the permitting process.
If I may, it may actually be a little bit more complicated than that because of the fact that the state window for provisional has closed for the non-equity and is closing for the equity at, I believe, the end of this month. So, you know, the issue is we'd be sort of telling everyone, just a reminder, essentially, you can't be cultivating without a state license. And for those that are cultivating without a state license, they need to not cultivate until they have applied for and obtained that license. I think and try and make this, I'm worried I might be making it too confusing. So for those that are in this bucket of legacy cultivators who are currently cultivating in an area that they would not be able to apply for a phase 3 permit, and for which they do not have a current state license. They could stop cultivating now, continue to apply for the local license, obtain the local license, obtain the state annual license, and then resume cultivating under that state license once it's issued. And really, legally, that's the only thing they are allowed to do. You know, state law would not allow them to continue to cultivate. without having that provisional or without having the state license. The question would be essentially what happens if we catch them? What happens if we find out that they are cultivating during this time period and that they haven't had the state license? Do they then, does that affect their status on the local level? Do they get denied? And then if they do get denied, do you leave in an ability for them to reapply at that same location once they have an appropriate permit?
And the state wants us to say that if we find them cultivating, they don't have a state license, that they're denied a local.
That was my understanding. I don't recall them saying anything specifically as to them relocating. As I think you can still make a decision as to whether or not you'd want to allow them to resume activities at that location. And I might look to the director or the CEO as to their understanding of what the state was asking, but my takeaway was that they didn't like that people could essentially be in good standing under the local permit program when they were operating illegally under the state's program.
But if the person, going back to that first question I had about if we have in the ordinance that says you have to have a state license to cultivate, then they wouldn't be in good standing because they're cultivating without following everything in our permit.
Yeah, and that might be the smallest of possible change you can make here, because right now it doesn't say you have to have a state license to cultivate. It says if you have a local permit, you have to have a state license and you have to maintain it. It's actually silent as to what happens if you're in the application process.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? Okay, Supervisor Mulhern.
Yeah, I just think that the reasons that people have or have not applied for state licenses might be very complicated. And so I understand that what the state's getting at, it's illegal to cultivate. However, many people have cultivated illegally in Mendocino County for generations. So how do we, I guess, navigate this process with some type of efficiency? And I think urgently, and to add to my list of things that can go out in Canna Notes, is a notice to anybody that receives Canna Notes, hopefully through advocacy groups, that cultivating at this point, if you do not have a state license, is illegal. It's spring, so people will be planting their gardens for the year, and at the very minimum, to be put on notice that this is an incorrect way to operate your business at this point. I personally would like to see, and I believe the community would like to see, as many operators as possible be able to continue through this process. And if that means that you can't cultivate this season while you're applying through your permit locally and with your state license, while that is not ideal, that doesn't, end that person's business and lifestyle for the rest of all eternity. It's, disappointing for this season, or, challenging for this season. My barrier, again, is just on the specific properties that might not be able to continue through the permitting process. And it's not so easy as just moving on to a different property. And again, I have a lot of concerns about the economic viability of specific properties and what's going to happen to them. So that's where I'm thinking about things right now. And I don't know if we want to talk about the other reprioritization questions beyond the state licensing before we open for public comment?
I would defer to the committee and the chair.
Well, you're talking about whether we consider deprioritization as kind of kicked out or back of the line. That's basically the question, isn't it?
Or quite frankly, even potentially eliminate deprioritization for taxes entirely, right? There's some question as to whether it's really providing an effective incentive, and is this the tool that you want going forward in addressing that issue?
Yeah, so elimination of the deprioritization, so all that effort to deprioritize people will now be, just used for the state license. Depending on what we do with that.
Yeah, and I guess part of my thought process here is that deprioritization is sort of an inherently ambiguous and maybe kind of clumsy tool. That exactly what happens when you're deprioritized, and what that's going to mean for the operation of the department, what that's going to mean for an individual applicant. It essentially varies based on the resources that are out there, et cetera. My general recommendation when it comes to deprioritization is, use it in the short term while you're figuring out what you want your scheme to look like ultimately in the long term. Because I don't know that it ultimately becomes an ideal solution for how do we handle those people that haven't paid their taxes, or how do we handle those people that are cultivating in violation of the state licensing requirements.
So if a person didn't pay their taxes and they decided not to come into the system with the proposal for the repayment of back taxes and all that, then is their permit affected in any way at this point?
Are you talking about right now, or are you talking about one of the hypotheticals?
Am I talking about, what was that last part?
Oh, one of the hypotheticals. I wasn't quite clear.
Well, it's a hypothetical.
Okay.
Right?
So if someone, let's assume the ordinance passes tomorrow for the tax relief, and then let's assume that the board decides to say eliminate deprioritization. What that would mean is that if you fail to come into the compliance plan, that doesn't
Compliance plan of
the taxes,
right?
Yeah, then that wouldn't change your status on the permitting side at all, right? You just get permitted reviewed, same as any other. It would mean that reduces the incentive to enter into the compliance plan, although you still have an incentive based on waiver of penalties and interests if you go ahead and do that. So it would put a little bit more of a burden on the enforcement side, but it would relieve some of the confusion and some of the uncertainty on the permitting side.
So the person could have a permit, owe back taxes, not get into our relief plan, and continue on with their permit in perpetuity.
Yeah, and that's correct. Now, the back taxes would then have to be enforced through tax collection measures, right, rather than through the permitting side. The other thing that's a little bit unclear at this moment is, what does it mean? We have an annual permitting set up. What does it mean if you have a permit and you fail to pay your taxes at some point in the future, right? If that means you're deprioritized, what does that mean for your status? Are you operating it illegally or not, right? You've gotten a permit, your permit has expired, you've applied for a new one, but the department just hasn't gotten around to it. Is that really providing an adequate incentive to go ahead and pay your taxes? Is that enforcement regime that is moving forward the goals of, compliance with the ordinance? Is that a system that, code enforcement's able to work with and understand what someone's status is? So there's a number of pros and cons on a number of these pieces.
Yeah, and it seems like most of this is theoretical since we don't have applications going through the process or making it through the process to their permits.
Right. Although my understanding is that a certain number of the annual renewal applications have been deprioritized due to non-payment of taxes.
Right.
Mr. Chair, I think the director has her highlighter up.
Director Nevedal.
Thank you. So just to one of the questions that was raised about what the status is for folks who are deprioritized. So the status remains active as far as local authorization is concerned. We just aren't able to review the applications. So we are not revoking. I just want to make sure it's clear that we have not revoked local authorization for folks who are deprioritized. And so when it comes to the zoning questions about phase 3, the fact that folks are deprioritized and have zoning and are on a zoning that may not be eligible for an application under phase 3 isn't maybe fully relevant to the conversation. I think it's relevant to the conversation if the board were to consider putting a denial in place where they could potentially be denied for their deprioritization status, right? But currently, we are not removing that local authorization, so they are not falling out of the system. And they could still apply for a state license. They would have to essentially at this point wait until they received an annual license to commence their cultivation activities. So I hope that helps to clarify some pieces.
All right. County Council.
If I may, so I think what I hear the director saying, at least on the annuals, to answer my earlier question, is that if someone has an annual permit from the county, they
From
fail,
the county?
Yeah, from the county. They fail to pay their taxes, and they submit for renewal next year. They continue to be allowed to cultivate. They continue to be identified to the state as someone who can apply for and obtain an annual permit on the state level, but we're just not reviewing their application on the local level. And so they're paying the fee. The application is coming in, but are we ensuring compliance? Right? Are we reviewing? Are we doing our annual inspection? Are we doing the various things that are sort of intended to ensure that people continue to comply with the requirements of the ordinance? And if we're not, but we're still allowing people to cultivate, is that really serving the purpose of the deprioritization, and is it really creating the incentive for people to go pay their taxes?
Okay. Let's go to public comment.
Continue to think that we make this more complicated than it needs to be. And there are complications, but I think that from my perspective, the complications are not in the locations that maybe staff thinks that there are. It has always been known that you can't conduct the activity without local authorization, and then as soon as state licenses are available, without a state license. Whether it was a temporary state license, a provisional state license, or eventually an annual state license. And I know that anybody who, let's say when phase 1 reopened for that little period of time, I advised people that you cannot begin to start cultivating till you had your local embossed receipt, and at that time it would be a provisional because temporaries were gone. And it took 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever. They couldn't start cultivating. I know that there are people who break the rules for sure. I'm not saying that those people don't exist out there, but I think that there's always been enforcement tools available to the county on all levels, whether through code enforcement, through tax collection, through whatever, to utilize for the basic situation, which is you're not following the rules. So I think that overcomplicating it with use this as a basis of denial, I don't know that it provides the clarity that isn't already there. There are the rule breakers who are always going to break the rules. Hopefully, very few. I wonder, with respect to the state license requirement, how many and whether we can figure out how many are misalignment issues, not no license issues. So are people conducting activity that they shouldn't be conducting with the local and the state authorization? That's one set of things that I think could probably be dealt with through enforcement. Pretty clear. You're not allowed to. Don't do it. Then there's do we have alignment issues because there were changes and confusions and all kinds of things as things went on about having the right kind of state license, or even some clarity about when you needed to have the state license. Some people had temporary, they didn't quite get the transition to the other ones, whatever. So there might be some alignment issues, and I think it might help us analyze all of this to see if that's some of the problem, because that clearly is a different situation, and there are, in my estimation, some nuances to that create, sadly, more complexities and are not that simple. A good example, just so that you all can understand, is this conversion from what used to be, I'm going to actually go back in time. Some people misunderstood that if they used fairy lights on their canopy for even just a couple of weeks, they didn't realize that that was mixed light. That's just not what they thought. Well, they were wrong. So then they realized, oh my gosh, that's mixed light. They were told you have to apply for a mixed light license. Well, then it turns out, well, they're not really doing it on their canopy, they're doing it on their immature plant area, and now all of a sudden the definition has changed, and so that's really back to outdoor. So, there may be some alignment issues there. Have they applied? Have they not applied? Whatever. I really think it's worth us looking at what's what. With respect to the tax issue, and I appreciate the eliminate deprioritization for taxes entirely, because I don't think that it's an excellent tool. And not just because of these complications, but because the tax structure is not reasonable. And the efforts right now to provide some relief have recognized that. Long-term, the changes that need to be done have to do with it being tied to gross receipts and not just applied
Okay.
no matter what.
Can you wrap it up,
Yes,
please?
absolutely. So I think that unless the tax structure and the fundamental part of the tax structure, aside from the temporary relief provisions, are addressed, it doesn't make sense to tie deprioritization to the tax structure when there are so many fundamental issues. I also just want to say that people can apply for state licenses. It's just that they won't get a provisional license. They would have to wait for all of CEQA. And again, they know that they can't conduct the activity. At this point, it might be quicker for them to get a state annual than process their provisional anyway. So anyway, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could just clarify one thing. Ms. Nelson had asked as to how many of those were misalignment issues, and based on the numbers we're providing, the answer is 0. The state quoted us 229 applicants that are in the county system that are not in the state system at all. They might have at some point in the past applied, but they have no current application, no pending application. They just aren't in there.
Okay. Michael Katz.
Yes, good morning, supervisors, county staff. Michael Katz, Executive Director for the Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. Appreciate the conversation. yes, the agenda item was phrased in a confusing way, but now that we've talked about it, the deprioritization program as it is currently laid out, as we have pointed out a number of times, is actually not based on board direction. The board direction that was actually provided on April 19th was upon motion by Supervisor McGorty, seconded by Supervisor Jurdy. It is ordered that the Board of Supervisors requires tax compliance for cannabis permit renewal. Direct staff to return to the board with options for implementation of a payment plan, and directs the executive office to return with numbers regarding options for the tax rate. So that was April, almost a year ago, that was the direction that was given. And then soon thereafter, it was turned into what has now become the deprioritization program, which is just, totally overreach from what was initially intended. And so the concerns that you all are raising today are significant, which is why we've been calling for the end of the deprioritization program. We appreciated the tax payment plan component because it would enable people to get reprioritized, but because of the timeline of implementing that, as we've heard today, that might not be sufficient for getting the people on tax back in line quickly enough. So we certainly would agree with an end to the deprioritization program, or at a minimum, creating a mechanism for the people who are going to participate in the tax payment plan to let the county know so they can be reprioritized. As far as the additional conversations that have been happening, doesn't seem that there needs to be an ordinance amendment for this particular component, because this was a program that was never built into the ordinance, was never considered in the ordinance. So if there are other goals that are being discussed, that would be something that might want to come back later on, once we stop the deprioritization right now, so we can make sure that we don't lose any operators unintentionally. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. I guess a question that comes up from that comment is there a way, because of the timelines, to have people sign an affidavit that they will be joining the tax relief program, and so that they can be prioritized again?
I think, Mr. Chair, that there may already be features of that built into the ordinance that you will be considering as a full board tomorrow, and which you had the first reading of at the prior meeting. It didn't require an affidavit. It required them to sign, I believe, an agreement with the tax collector. We did have conversations with the tax collector's office, so they're aware of the timeline, 30 days before the ordinance became effective, but they may be able to start rolling out those documents and start rolling out some features of that in advance, with the understanding that, if there were, for example, a referendum in the 30 days, it wouldn't be effective, but we can reasonably sort of plan that it's likely to be, and then apply at that point.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Any other further comments from the public in the chambers? Okay, any online? Monique Ramirez.
Good afternoon, Monique Ramirez, District 3. I just want to support MCA's memo and Michael Katz's suggestions today in this meeting. And at the end of the day, we really need to stop looking at operators as illegal operators, because people are trying their best to be licensed. And the further this drags on with people not being able to get licensed, we will see everyone go back to the other market. So let's figure this out. I think that, if there's a way to get people to sign up for this new tax option to pay back their back taxes, that's great. And stop deprioritizing these applicants. It's their whole life on the line. So we just have to figure it out. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Paul Hansberry.
Hi, yes, this is Paul Hansberry. Totally support the previous speakers. I think that one solution is just a simple one. I think that it could be categorized as technical support, so you could get the funding for this sort of thing through this grant funding. If you had a one-on-one interview with people to go over their application, so you wouldn't have this long time delay, 2 weeks to get back for this email and answer that email and then respond and back and forth. If a one-on-one situation where the meeting where you could schedule an hour or an hour and a half to go over the application so that they understand that that an embossed receipt is a local authorization. Perhaps they're waiting for their permit, the difference between a stamped receipt and a permit. Sometimes it takes the human touch to break the farmer bureaucrat barrier. So something like that could be implemented. I think it would go a long way to help streamline and solve a lot of, eliminate a lot of the confusion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Online, in person? All right, back to the committee.
Excuse me, through the chair, if I may. Kim Saylor, Deputy Clerk of the Board. We do have 2 voicemails.
My name is Jude Tillman, and I speak in public expression today as the owner of Dragonfly Wellness Center on the Mendocino coast. I strongly urge the county through the Board of Supervisors to send a letter of support for AB 1111, sponsored by Assemblymember Pellerin. Avenues of success for our small legacy farmers are shrinking in the face of large operator takeovers of the statewide marketplace. Those large...
Yeah, thank you. So that should be in public comment, all right? Okay, so we have Mike Adams.
Hi, thank you for taking the time for my comments. I'd like to suggest that, or echo some of the comments that were expressed earlier, that some of this may be in relation to the first topic, but regarding the LEAP program, that people already in the LEAP program and moving forward in the LEAP program are able to continue moving forward, and that staffing issues be addressed to move people in that direction, and that we move people in the
Hello, Mike.
This is Lillian Bearden, Deputy Clerk of the Board. It looks like he has left the Zoom call.
Okay. All right, so that's it for public comments on item 2B. Okay, so back to the committee. So, Supervisor
Go ahead, you have a...
Yeah, County Council, can you tell us what you need from us today?
Well, so again, I don't know if the things are particularly time sensitive. So to Supervisor Mulhern's point, if you wanted to continue this to the next meeting, you certainly could. I would say and obviously the request that we got from DCC was just this last Friday. So there hasn't exactly been a whole lot of time to look at what that might mean. And exactly how it would work out. So certainly that's an option. I would say you've got 2 different pieces of this. One is the tax piece. One is the state license piece. And I would suggest for each of those, whether it's today, whether it's another meeting, you form some sort of recommendation to the board as to what is going to happen with those that are deprioritized. Whether that's eliminate deprioritization, whether that's make the deprioritization the basis for deprioritization, a basis for denial, but have some sort of recommendation for some plan to the full board.
Okay. Okay, and with the state desire, with their letter, that really isn't about deprioritization, that's about a change to our ordinance, right?
Right. Now, we did identify that as relevant to the deprioritization discussion because one of the bases for the deprioritization is this same basis. But yes, that is correct.
Okay. Supervisor Mulhern, do you have any comments on this?
Not any additional comments. I think my concerns remain the same, and I understand in both aspects, and I'll take first the tax item. You know, I think one of the things that the board is constantly being asked to consider is that beyond our current 863 applications, we have many members of our community, 90,000, that also pay taxes, pay property taxes, pay business taxes. Concerns that I heard from the community regarding the tax item that I brought forward to the last GGC meeting and to the board, and that we'll consider, is that you know, that there is some expectations, I think, in general, as a member of a community and as a member of the business community, that you are paying your taxes and keeping them updated, which also, while understanding the cannabis department's need to prioritize applications to get them through the state licensing process, I just really understand there's, you know, 3 different aspects that we're looking at with those items, and I think that's important for us to consider as we move forward with the tax item and the payment plan. I think it's not been the intention of this board or previous boards to allow people to continue cultivate without coming into compliance. And so that was the payment plan opportunity was an intent to make that possible for people. Regarding the letter from the state, you know, I'm taking very seriously the state's willingness to partner with us and move things forward. And I do hear clearly that they do not want people cultivating in Mendocino County that have not gotten their state license. And from the perspective of a cultivator, there may have been many reasons why that hasn't happened yet. So what I would love to know is, can we include some type of information to cannabis cultivators and a Cananote through updates that you cannot cultivate this season without your state license? Maybe that includes the notice for fallowing or what have you, or a notice for withdrawal if they don't intend to continue through the process. And I suppose reminding or encouraging them that they need to apply for the state license, and they have X number of days within which to do that. 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, I don't know, before we move forward with putting anything into an ordinance.
So if I may, through the chair, currently the notice of deprioritization does include a request that if an individual does not have a state license to send to us, that they do apply for a state license immediately, and it includes the link by which you can go apply for your state license. It takes you directly to the application portal. We are more than happy, and I do have it noted, that we should add this item to a Cananote, which I believe we can send out later today. And I think the options for individuals who don't have state licenses at this time would be to file the applicable non-operational status, which for applicants is notice of applications day. For permit holders is a notice of non-cultivation. And we can link to a withdrawal form. But again, I just want to make sure that especially members of the public are aware that fallowing is not a non-operational status.
If I could just clarify, fallowing is primarily for tax purposes, right? So merely complying with all the requirements for fallowing may not be enough to get you out of a need for a state license. On the other hand, if you don't want to file a non-op, and if you do want to continue to pursue your license, you don't want to withdraw it, you could fallow as long as you don't engage in any of those activities that would require a state license that you don't have.
Supervisor Mulhern.
I just appreciate the clarification. I'm well known for misusing terms. So I'm sure that the counter notes will clarify what exactly the forms are that people need to fill out.
So to move this forward, we can, I mean, there's so many moving parts to it. And it seems like the first thing we need to do is get the recommendation that the board approved, the tax relief passed. And then we will see how many people take advantage of it within the next month or two, right? Probably after the first month. And that will give us a greater idea about what's happening, right? I do take seriously the state's letter and trying to figure out how to move that forward. I think that if we need to change the ordinance to accomplish that, I would be looking at that too, see what the rest of the board thinks. But I do think that with this partnership we have with the state at this point, we need to kind of be partners. So with that said, are we just going to, as we say, kick the can down the road?
I'm not sure if staff has enough direction at this point, but I'd like to just hear this. Perhaps this item needs to come back to GDC in April.
Yeah, I think if I understood the chair's suggestion correctly, what we would do is wait to see what happens on the tax side, because that might inform the decision as to what you do on the prioritization. And then on the state license side, it sounds like you might be able to proceed with the notification, reminder essentially to people as to the state licensing requirements. At the same time, we might work with the state for a little bit of a clarification as to what specifically they might want there, and then come back for a further discussion in April. Is that the proposal?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Supervisor Mulhern.
Yeah, I think that the further discussion might look like, what does code enforcement look like on this one? Let's have a realistic expectation as to what's going to happen for those 270 applicants.
All right. Do we have proper direction? Okay. So we'll move on to public expression, item 3A.
Katz, Executive Director for the Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. Related to the last item, Cannanotes is okay, but it's a flawed system because it's voluntary. People sign up for it. We've definitely recommended to people that they sign up. I think it would be much better in terms of reaching people if the department were able to actually just use the email addresses for each applicant and just email directly to the operators to let them know about things that are essential for people to know. Cannanotes also would be great to get as much information through there as possible. Secondly, submitted a letter in support of AB 1111, which is the Cannabis Small Producer Event Sales License being brought by Assemblymember Pellerin, also co-authored by our North Coast representatives, Senator McGuire and Assemblymember Wood, and also sponsored by Origins Council. And this is a bill that is aligned similarly with AB 2691 that this board supported last year in support of cannabis sales licenses that would enable our local small producers to sell direct to consumers at a limited number of events during the year. So this is an incredibly important part of the overall package for our small cultivators to be able to survive. And so we urge the board at their earliest convenience to submit a letter of support for AB 1111 in line with the support that was provided last year for AB 2691. And there will be a hearing on this item. I believe it's April 9th or April 11th. So if the sooner that letter could be submitted, the better. So hopefully it could be introduced at that committee hearing. Thank you so much for your support of this important item and all of your work. Thank you.
Thank you. For a process question, with this AB 1111, it seems like it follows what the legislative platform has been asking for the last several years. And could we get the chair of the board to write a letter in support?
CEO Antle, yes, we can work with the chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll make this brief. First off, thank you on the 1111 work, because it is really important to push this along and show active support as quickly and early and often as possible. And in that light, if supervisors are going to the CSAC and the legislative component, maybe talking it up and talking to your colleagues is a good idea as well as communicating to the lobbyist for the county to do some active engagement as well. So that would be excellent. I concur with Michael about the Canna notes, and I certainly appreciate Canna notes and definitely appreciate the desire to make them more flowing and more information, but I would also strongly recommend emailing each applicant. We have all that information. It just doesn't seem like an email list is that onerous to use, and that hits every applicant for anything that's important. And along those lines, I'm wondering if there's quite a few people who, since they last directly had communications with the department, which could be if they were, let's say, in the first portal, potentially not for a year and a half or 2 years, that they've just kind of bowed out and they never formally withdrew. So I'm just wondering if some of the lack of state licensure might fall into that category, so it might not be as bad as we fear in terms of the non-followers. And I really hope that we can get back to the details of a work plan for all of the work, including those that hopefully will be reprioritized as quickly as possible. And I still would urge you to recommend to the full board to just reprioritize and work on the long-term issues as you need to. Thank you.
Anyone else in the chamber? All right, going to Corinne Powell.
Thank you for the opportunity to address you again. I have a suggestion, and it really was pertaining more to the concept of streamlining within the department. And I am requesting, and I believe Supervisor Haschek mentioned this once before as perhaps appropriate at this time, and that is a working group that is composed of the government committee, representatives from staff, and representatives from the stakeholders community regarding how to streamline the application process. Those who are affected and those who must manage have to find some middle ground. So that is one recommendation. Otherwise, on this issue, of course, I am supporting AB 1111. And I always support Hannah Nelson and MCA. Thank you very much.
And just a reminder that we do have planned that April 14th meeting to talk about streamlining the ordinance. Okay, Harrison Sugar. Harrison. Okay, Monique Ramirez.
Thank you, Monique Ramirez, District 3. I just want to say I support AB 1111, and thank you to Supervisor Haschek for getting that a letter written. That's great. And again, I just want to say that I really wish that the GC could somehow recommend to the Board of Supervisors that we need to figure out how to get staffing in place to continue processing the LEAP applications. I don't know when that can happen or how, but people that are right at the end of the finish line, we really need to get them in to that funding pool. So thank you so much again for this meeting. I appreciate you guys and all your work. Thank you.
Okay, is Harrison Sugar on the line? Okay, going to the voicemail. Okay, Harrison. Voicemail. Somebody. Okay, we don't have anyone. What about the voicemail?
My name is Jude Tillman, and I speak in public expression today as the owner of Dragonfly Wellness Center on the Mendocino Coast. I strongly urge the county through the Board of Supervisors to send a letter of support for AB 1111, sponsored by Assemblymember Pellerin. Avenues of success for our small legacy farmers are shrinking in the face of large operator takeovers of the statewide marketplace. Those large operators cannot retain the quality and genetics that have been carefully cultivated over generations in the producer counties. At Dragonfly, we are proud to feature the exceptional products of our local farmers. We need their commitment to purity, potency, and the medicinal value of small batch craft cultivars. This legacy helps the many local residents and visiting tourists that come to Mendocino to rest and recover from a range of conditions, from stress and anxiety to cancer. Our local cannabis farms are a rich repository of medicines that, unfortunately, are losing the competition game in the larger marketplace. We need to support every effort and the creation of every venue to keep the small producers alive so that they can continue to do what only they can do best. We cannot lose this medicinal cannabis resource. Thank you for your commitment to supporting AB 1111.
Hi, this is Tamara Kislak from That Good Farm calling for public expression. I'd like you to play this message if you can instead of my last one. Now that I've had a good night's sleep and a little bit of caffeine, I'd like to be more succinct. I would like to ask the committee members to please support State Bill 1111 in any way that they can to help small cultivators like those in Mendocino County begin the process of true self-distribution and direct-to-consumer sales. This is a great step in the right direction for us to have parity with other industries like wine and other cultivation within the state. So we'd like to ask for your help. We really appreciate anything you can do to let the state know that the County of Mendocino is in support of the bill. Thank you.
Are there others? That's it? Okay, Harrison Sugar, is he on the line still?
Hello.
Hi, Harrison.
Sorry about my microphone problems earlier. I appreciate you all with the recent economic reforms passed and the effort for the streamlined permitting motion as well. I would just like to offer the solution of having previous phase one operators who withdrew the possible chance back is like you're doing with the deprioritized operators, a path back to getting their applications into the program. A lot of these reforms, as well as the fouling measures, came along too late to hold on for handfuls of operators. And if you're going through this process, I would like to urge you all to consider these applicants that, for instance, paid their taxes and decided to step out because they could no longer warrant the expenditures and afford to. These same possible opportunities to make for a more robust cannabis program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, that's it for the public expression. So moving on to item 3B, approval of minutes of the February 27th, 2023 regular meeting.
Move approval of the February meeting minutes.
Okay, second. Are there any public comments? Seeing none? Okay, call the question.
Chair Hashak?
Yes.
Supervisor Mulhorn?
Yes.
The motion moves unanimously.
Okay, very good. So just a reminder, we're looking at April 14th for that meeting starting at 10:30 to discuss streamlining the ordinance. Conference room C.
Question for the executive office. That meeting will be publicly noticed, and is there an opportunity to do it hybrid, such as we've done today with a Zoom, so that people don't have to physically be in the conference room? Yes, thank you. Oh, was there a yes? I'm not sure where you're
Yes,
looking.
it's a yes, sorry. I
Okay.
had to put my mic off.
Okay,
Thank you.
very good. So at 12:16, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody.